So I'd like to welcome our viewers from around the world to the International and Interdisciplinary Conference on the Future of Work in the Age of Automation and AI. My name is Igor Shoikhedbrod, and I am the postdoctoral fellow in the Ethics of AI, in the Ethics of AI lab at the University of Toronto Centre for Ethics. And it is my great privilege and delight to be joined by some of the leading scholars on the future of work. I'm going to keep my remarks very brief so that we can progress based on our schedule. Our first speaker is going to be Professor Aleena Chia from Simon Fraser University, from the Department of Communications, and the title of her presentation is going to be Self-Making and Game Making in the Future of Work. And without further ado, Professor Chia, take it away.
Thank you, Igor. So thanks to fellow conference attendees who are here today to listen. It's 9 a.m. in Vancouver right now, and happy to have some some social contact and talk about this stuff. Really thinking about the future of work. This looks like, for a while now, this looks like what the future of work is going to look like. Just all of us doing things online, and so today I want to sort of rewind a little bit and think about end of work narratives. So this was for narratives or like literature from the 1990s, where sociologists were talking about how work was changing and how work was going to be different. And we had to think about how it was ending, right, in the way traditional work was ending in the way that we had thought about it. And I'm going to use that to transition to think about how today, what is known as post-work literature, how this assault on the work ethic, how that gels together. And I'm going to use an example from gaming. I am an ethnographer of gaming cultures to think through this topic. So what happens when people's expectations of careers are displaced from work to leisure, such as gaming? That's something that I'm going to be thinking about and talking about, moving us through, and also about the politics of time. I was very happy to see that Veena is also working on time. So, there's a nice transition between, both of our work. And I'm going to be thinking specifically about biography, precarity, and this notion of clock and event time, and how that changes and how that affects people who are doing work, or people who, who are experiencing this. How do they experience time, and how does that shift? So in my previous work, I've argued, along with other scholars of creative industries, that there is a kind of compensatory morality between work and wages. So those of you who study creative industries, this will be very familiar. It's this idea that, that there is a trade-off between vocational passion and pain, right? And this derives from the work ethic. And what I'm interested in is how this kind of archaic sensibility, it inoculates the future of work. So today specifically, I want to talk about how this kind of compensatory thinking, it is a reduction of a model of balance. In fact, a model of balance that has roots in medieval times, and how it's marked not just by this dualism, this image of a scale, right? That's how people think about these trade-offs, as more of one means less of another. Working from home means, it means that you have less of home life, this idea of work-life balance. But really this idea of balance, it is much more complex than that, right? It's about a complex systematicity, which has to do more with equilibrium between, a number of factors, a number of, of multiple and intersecting multidimensional factors, rather than just two. And at the end of this talk, by the end of this talk, I want to think about the implications for these models that we cultivate, because the model of balance is a kind of model, and it is a base on which we base, other kinds of other ideas, right? And how it has a real force in the world. And what does this mean for post-work demands and post-work imaginaries? So, onto the chronopolitics of the future of work. So Mark Banks, he had this lovely essay called Biography, Precarity, and Event, where he re-interviews creative workers 20 years later, right, to test out this hypothesis, to test out this argument about whether or not this argument about how, when workers are living, with precarity, there is a waning of this continuity in their stories of self. There's a waning of the durability of our social lives that are tied to work, right? So in the work of Richard Sennett, for example, you think about how he talked about during the new economy, you didn't have that after pub meetup. You didn't have that water cooler sociality that consolidates what he called character, right? And more recently, Guy Standing has talked about the erosion of the trajectories of occupational development. Okay, so 20 years later, Mark Banks, he found that there are some entrepreneurial creative workers who do have a sense of continuity, right, in their conceptions of self, right, in their conceptions of work, but that their success came at the expense of other employees' precarity. So, there's a sense that that we will be familiar with, for example, Sarah Sharma's work, where she talks about, how time, right, or the chronopolitics of saving time, right, on one hand means, a time suck for other people, right, and this idea of power chronography relates back to Doreen Massey's notion of power geometry, how we're all linked together in a kind of like giant complex cat's cradle, and when you pull on one string, the other string moves. So what happens when one's life is composed of one precarious gig after another? In my ethnographic work with video game players and video game hobbyists, right, I talked to a lot of people. One of them was like Ned. He was from Boston, and I met him through a hobby organization. So this is a hobby organization of more than 3,000 people across the US, who meet up twice a month, and social events more than that, to coordinate, different kinds of play activities, different kinds of play practices. And what I was interested in was how it was organized leisure, okay? And Ned, his job, so he loved games and he wanted to work in games. He embodied this kind of, he had a romantic notion towards wanting to have his job, right, be something that he loved. So he wanted to do what he loved. He wasn't able to work in game development per se. He wasn't able to work in game design, but he did work a string of contract jobs doing quality assurance, so play testing for several large game companies in Boston, as well as elsewhere in the US. So when Ned is testing games, this is what Simon Hidd calls a digital assembly line, right? Because he's working in a warehouse, with 600 other workers in 8-hour shifts, literally around the clock. So these shifts will be staggered, right? And they will be shuffled, okay? And he barely knew his coworkers, You don't even want to talk about water cooler. Even on his smoke breaks, right? He wouldn't have the chance to talk to people, to build the kind of social bonds, much less, the kind of solidarity that as researchers, in this field, we're always, looking for. We're always trying to find opportunities, to find. So these people never lasted, right? His smoke breaks were timed, and these shifts were constantly shuffled. So what kind of story did he tell about his life? Who were the characters that populated his story? They didn't come from work, but they came from the continuity of his leisure activities, of organized leisure, right? The progression of skills that he gained, of knowledge, and of social status that comes from what Robert Stebbins calls a serious leisure career. I can speak more, about what this looks like, perhaps in the discussion. I have more discussion. I have more examples, and I know that Cynthia is also going to be talking, about leisure and volunteerism. So I'm pretty happy to think about that more throughout the 3 hours that we have. But for now, I'm going to skip past my examples and move on more to thinking about the critique of what I've called compensatory morality, and this derives from a cultural historian. Stephen Gelber, who studied hobbies. Okay, so what I want to highlight here is that when gamers talk about work and play, when they talk about games and hobbies, they do so in compensatory ways. And that people that I spoke to, they talked openly about how their gaming activities filled in for what their lives lacked. So during a period of time, if they were out of work, their leisure activities gave them a sense that, that they were in control, gave them a sense of power over others. Sometimes it gave them stability, sometimes it gave them romance. But they always talked about it as a compensatory relationship to their lives. And this is not surprising at all, given that video games are understood through the lens not only of immersion, but also through escapism, right? It's another world. It's comparable to, but ultimately inferior to the real world. That's not something that I believe. That's something that's, that's in the rhetoric of games, right? In the media as well as in everyday life. So I'm sure you guys have seen the news about COVID and how people are escaping to this video game called Animal Crossing, where they have their own comforting island away from, away from the anxieties of the pandemic. Games are often portrayed as a kind of simulation of real life activities, of real life skills training, right? As a compensation for adventure, heroism, and athleticism that the stereotypical white male geek gamer lacks in real life, okay? And also most popular games, they are about progression. They are about achievement and mobility, which precarious workers like Ned, they don't have. So this kind of compensatory thinking, it extends beyond games to game production as a creative industry, and beyond that to other creative industries. And people's passion for wanting to work in games, this idea of doing what you love and getting paid, is seen in terms of trade-off, right? And work and life seem in terms of a balance. They balance out each other, and you can't have more of one, without having less of another. And yet at the same time, what really interests me about this kind of rhetoric is that somehow within the future of work, right, within the idea of flexibility, you can have both. However, at the same time, if you can have both, then how is it that if you have one, you have less of another? So this has been something that's interested me for a while, that how these trade-offs, right, are really, they derive from what Andrew Ross, right, has called a sacrificial ethos. And this relates specifically to creative industries. Angela McRobbie as well has called this a pain and pleasure axis. So even analysts of this kind of compensatory morality think about it in terms of the image of a scale. And where does this image of a scale come from? It comes from a very archaic sort of morality, right? David Graeber has traced this back to the Victorian essayist Thomas Carlyle's Gospel of Work, right? In which he stated that work should be painful and that the misery of the job is itself what forms character, okay? So this idea that we must suffer for work is an archaic sensibility, and it really inoculates the future of work, right? Which is the kind of disconnect here. Think about the future of flexibility, of doing everything you want, of working from home, of having it all. And yet, why are we shackled to this kind of image of this scale? Okay. So this is a sense-making framework that has a real force in the world. And what I want to talk about today is how compensatory thinking is a model. And it's not just morality, but it's also a kind of causality. It also has to do with notions of commensuration and also of equity. It has much deeper roots in the new economy than the new economy, okay? And Ralph Waldo Emerson, he had this lovely essay on compensation and about how, the universe operates according to a justice in the form of compensation, which functions through metaphysical checks and balances to bring actions and effects into a moral as well as into a material equilibrium. So this is really the kind of model that that I want us to shift to when we think about compensatory morality. That it's not so much a scale, but it is this kind of this overarching model of balance. And Joel Kay, right, who's a historian, he traces us back to the 1300s. This model of balance is emergent during this time. And it is about not a scale, but it's about a kind of complex system where individual disorder, individual imbalance is subsumed by the equilibrium of the larger whole. And this is not, it's not the same as harmony, and it's not something that is decreed by a higher power. Instead, we'll be familiar with this in our age, especially. It's about emergent actions leading up to something greater that is more than a sum of its parts, okay? However, compensatory thinking is about dualistic forms of displacement in the register that I've spoken about earlier, okay? And this kind of dualistic simplification, right, it doesn't quite speak to the complex and nested systems of relationality, right, that come through in this older model of balance, okay? And it applies not just to sense-making discourses of creative workers, but it also applies to, as I said, right, when analysts, when researchers, such as Ross, such as McRobbie, analyze this kind of, what's happening when creative workers, when they want to love their jobs. So this is the argument that I'm making today, that compensatory thinking, it is very resilient precisely because of this reductionism. Precisely because it reduces these complex and nested systems of relationality, and it reduces this web of temporal and spatial relations into an individualized balance, okay, between work and life, between pain and pleasure. Okay? And as I've mentioned before, this reduces what Sarah Sharma calls power pornography, and what Doreen Massey calls power geometry. And instead it internalizes post-Fordist relations and all its global circuits of digital and material labor into a kind of personal trade-off that is born alone. Okay? So what can be done? Post-work theorists, they want to topple the work ethic, but through slogans and mottos. And without confronting this underlying model of balance, I think that it's going to be a very difficult task ahead, because a model is a cohesive, it is a unified idea. It forms the basis for other ideas. Yet because it operates beneath the level of consciousness, it's not readily available to discussion. It's not readily available to critique. Nonetheless, what it does is that it redirects our perception, our thoughts, and it has a real force in the world. Therefore, what I'm suggesting and what I'm recommending is that we need to intervene on multiple levels. So we need to intervene, yes, on the level of policy, on the level of infrastructure, and also, on the level of utopian imaginaries and directional demands. So here I'm thinking about the work of Kathy Weeks, thinking about the work of the accelerationists, and also on the levels of the structures of feeling of that work ethic, right? Because it has a particular structure of feeling that Andrea Muhlbach, has talked about in her ethnographic work. Beyond that, we also need to think about narratives of good work, okay? It's not just concepts, it's not just policies, it's also narratives. And this should be regardless of precarity. So I think we can narrativize good work, even though it is precarious, okay? And it should be more inclusive than the kinds of masculinized rhetorics of dignity, right, that come through in Western working class solidarity. I think we need to expand, the stories of what good work looks like beyond, a kind of nostalgic, kind of smokestack nostalgia. And many people within the realm of labor studies have been doing that. So Melissa Gregg, she talks about how the notion of a career has always been based on the concentration and accumulation of wealth. It has always been based on the polarity of labor and rewards. And it may have been attainable in some periods of industrial growth, but it's no longer fit for purpose. So what she's saying is that not a return to this career ladder, not a return to the usual trajectory of professional or occupational development. Instead of that, perhaps we can imagine, post-work productivity through different kinds of metrics. So not enterprise metrics, but metrics of our own kind, right? And through networks of our own kinds. Instead of ladders, we can structure our own sense of self through contributions to a collective, which is what people do in leisure societies. Of course, there is still hierarchy, there is still bureaucracy, there is still, lack of diversity, especially in these kinds of voluntary networks, but we can put out one fire at a time and in different places. So my research suggests that organized leisure can be part of this kind of equation. So I'm just gonna end quickly by saying that, that a post-work future will require confronting not just narratives, policies, but also the underlying models of balance or compensation, to see past and think past this veneer of compensatory thinking's dualism. This image of the scale is unhelpful because there are more than two things at play. There are nested complexities, geographies, temporalities in this tedious balancing act. Okay. So I want to end on an emerging sort of way I'm thinking about this. This is work in progress. That post-Fordist capitalism itself is a system of counterbalances that are rather rhetorical, affective, and economic. And our discontent is constantly compensated by these kinds of shifting forms of desire and these cruel forms of optimism, so that we see either work or pain, we see either pain or pleasure, instead of the kind of violence of equilibrium, right, in this vast and multidimensional web of relationality. And questioning this kind of equilibrium is not just as a natural course of events, but through collective action, I think will require the building of solidarity on this kind of shifting ground. So I'm done, thanks.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Veena Dubal from UC Hastings Law, and the title of her presentation is The Time Politics of Digital Piecework. Please take it away, Professor Dubal.
Thank you, Igor. And I just want to say how delightful it is to, in the middle of these unprecedented times, to connect with scholars across the world whose work I deeply, deeply respect. And I'm grateful to the Center for Ethics for convening us, and also to Marcus and Igor for all the work that they put together to make this happen. So I'm a law professor, but I'm a legal anthropologist. And in the tradition of anthropology, I'm going to read my talk. In a 1924 issue of True Romances magazine, an auto knitter hosiery company of Buffalo, New York advertisement targeted women as potential homemakers. The ad, entitled How They Make Money in Their Own Homes, centered the testimony of Mrs. Unger, who explained that her husband's wages were not enough to support their small family. But Mrs. Unger, who cared for their infant child, didn't want to go to work. Having heard through a friend about an opportunity to earn from the sanctity of her home, she sent off for yarn and instructions. Before long, Mrs. Unger said she was knitting for auto knitter hosier in real earnest, putting in every minute she could spare from her housework. Other manufacturers of the era similarly hawked homework as a pathway to profit and dignified labor for women who could earn extra money in their spare time. Of course, the reality of this work belied these commercial narratives on profit and dignity. Home workers, most commonly immigrant women laboring in crowded tenements, were paid by the piece, not the hour, and earned roughly 1/2 of what women factory workers made. Home workers interspersed these long, poorly paid hours of needling or knitting with other obligations of family and community life, including caring for children and the elderly, cleaning and preparing food. Through the sustained advocacy of labor and social reformers who were aghast at the intrusion of paid work into the sacred home and ways in which it undermined the full-time earnings of men, homework paid in piece was abolished by law in the US garment industry, and by the 1980s sanctioned through a highly regulated certification system in which workers were paid by the hour. But unregulated homework paid in piece has made a dramatic resurgence in the 21st century digital economy. Much of the debate around the future of work and automation in the US today focuses on the displacement of workers by technological advances. In imaginaries of this looming displacement, power is concentrated in entrepreneurial innovators and their master engineers, whose algorithms and machines aspire to mimic tasks or services traditionally completed by humans. But central to the infrastructure of artificial intelligence is the labor produced through global supply chains of dispersed and atomized data workers who pick, clean, label, and otherwise process the data that artificial intelligence cannot. Engineers use these data workers, accessing them through computing crowds on labor platforms like Crowdflower, Clickworker, or most commonly Amazon Mechanical Turk for cheap, fast performance. Workers are paid not for their time, but by the task, working quickly, earning in the US an average of $2 an hour. Because these digital piece workers are treated like independent contractors and neither data processing requesters nor the labor platform companies themselves assume the legal responsibilities of the employer, they labor with minimal to no standards, including no access to the minimum wage. And yet, their labor is central to the furious pace of automation. In this paper, my historical and ethnographic research averts the gaze from anxieties about the future of automation and work without workers to the past and present of the digital workers whose invisible labor, which cannot be automated, makes artificial intelligence possible. Technology capitalists like garment manufacturers of the early 20th century have found novel ways to disseminate much of the most time-intensive data work through piecework. The practice of paying workers to process data in their own homes and ostensibly on their own schedules by the piece lowers overhead and introduces flexibility to AI production. It also makes the work and working conditions invisible to all but those who conduct the work. Fascinatingly, as compared to other on-demand in-person service work in the so-called digital gig economy, this data processing piecework has received little to no regulatory attention or clarion calls from reformers to move to an hourly wage or employment model. The question is why? The answer, I contend, lies in the contemporary time politics of digital piecework. Before I get to this, I want to use the debates on US homework at the beginning of the 20th century to historically situate the experiences of data processing homeworkers today. The narrative of early homework reform efforts largely focused on a need to abolish the practice to protect the family from the ravages of industrial capitalism. This focus did the work of temporally and spatially reifying the cultural ideal of the nuclear family, exalting the full-time male breadwinner and concealing the ways in which unpaid domestic labor sustained capitalist economic systems. In the highly gendered and racialized garment homework economy of the early 20th century, this poorly paid piecework often took place in between and after care work, including preparing meals, caring for children, and cleaning the house. Manufacturers argued against providing higher wages to the women because they said home workers were just working casually for pin money and did not need to earn a living wage. They also argued that it was impossible to pay home workers by the hour because they could not keep track of how women worked in their own home. According to labor reformers during the Great Depression who hoped to abolish the practice, industrial homework curtailed the full-time factory employment of men and undercut wage and health standards. Unions claimed it was difficult to organize these isolated women workers and that their existence undermined striking factory workers. But the most effective arguments of social reformers focused on how homework commercialized the home, undermining, as the Labor Department Women's Bureau put it, the normal demands of home and children upon the housewife and mother. Emphasis on normal. While feminist historians have long highlighted the role that gendered space plays in this conceptualization, they have under-theorized the gendered time politics of both work and the subsequent debates about its state regulation. The woman homeworker's time was highly regulated by the tempo of her family and its demands. She was expected to fit in homework wherever possible. And because it was in between and not during designated hours, it was, as manufacturers argued, impossible to offer her an hourly wage. Indeed, industry representatives even tried to reframe homework as pleasure, describing it as part of the leisurely routine of small town life where a woman might make supplemental income while talking with her friends. A woman's time was dependent on her husband's work, on the needs of her children, and because homework was deemed secondary to family tasks, it was either conceptualized as pleasure that needed to pay adequately or exploitation that detracted from motherhood, work that should be and was eventually abolished. In the imaginary of regulators, homework was economically unnecessary because women could be dependent on their men. Unlike homework of the previous century, and in comparison to other realms of digitally mediated in-person piecework in the in-person piecework economy, US regulators have shown little interest in reforming or addressing the time-driven precarities of data processing piecework. In the post-Fordist neoliberal context, where the temporal and spatial boundaries between gendered work and the family are less demarcated and families are diversified, digital piecework is not understood as a social problem that needs to be eradicated. Allowed to flourish, it does the political work of reshaping everyday rhythms of workers in a way that reaffirms the economic function of the private family. Discursively and affectively, though critically not materially, digital piecework becomes a way for both women and men to achieve economic self-sufficiency, especially when no other paid work is available or possible. Examining the perspectives of contemporary AMT data processors, I argue that although they are ostensibly working on their own time, a chronopolitics emerges in which time accounted for in wage work becomes an invisible node of power. And here I also draw on the work of Sarah Sharma. This power reinforces the ideological commitment of all people to work all the time, filling their spare time with poorly paid productivity. In the bodies of the digital piece workers themselves, time politics both shapes the pace of digital capitalism and sustains anti-welfare subjectivities, in which people for whom work outside the home is impossible because of childcare, disability, or transportation do not demand state support, but rather attempt to minimally provide by moving frantically between the unpaid tasks of care work and digital piecework. Janie, for example, lives in a small former mining town in Appalachia and has been a digital piece worker for almost 5 years. After turning to the work amidst tragedy, her husband, the father of her 3 children, died of an opioid overdose. A friend recommended Amazon Mechanical Turk to her as a way she could earn money at home and not, she told me, just depend on welfare checks. There was nothing else around here. I mean, nothing, she explained. And even if there was, I couldn't do it. I have these kids. Even after taking in a new partner, Jamie had to continue to work as the breadwinner. She noted that her new boyfriend was younger and had never worked. These days, he works retail, the first job he's ever had. But, she says, the kids are mine, so I provide. Unlike homeworkers in the early 20th century, digital homeworkers of the neoliberal moment do not necessarily rely upon a single male breadwinner. For many, this is not pin money, but full-time work, or at least income upon which they are partially dependent. The temporal demands of family, however diversified, melds with the ideological weight of an internalized work ethic and individual responsibility. Instead of being criticized or critiqued for erasing life boundaries, digital homework is lauded for allowing workers to move quickly and flexibly between institutions of family and work to provide. Still, while digital piece workers like Jamie proudly bear the weight of breadwinning without state support, they also harbored many frustrations about how they were remunerated or not. Workers I spoke to were actually aware of how much time they spent looking for work or doing data processing tasks that went unpaid, and then how much time they spent doing unpaid care work. Their tasks shifted from minute to minute, second to second. They may be looking for good batches or labeling images for artificial intelligence systems, only to remember that it's time to pick up the kids or to make dinner. The lying discourses of flexibility that are used to defend digital piecework, the autonomy to engage in leisure and to volitionally decide how to spend time are circumscribed. Janie talked a lot about her frustration at how the temporal demands of Turking nagged at her throughout the day and even into the night. Both her conscious and unconscious time was spent looking for work, time, she explained, that wasn't compensated. If I work 12 to 16 hours a day, I'll make maybe $5 an hour, but that's when there's work. And when you're sitting in between jobs and you consider that time when you're just looking for work, then the hourly wage falls dramatically. There are so many of us now and fewer quality jobs. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night just to see if I can grab some good batches. Most are gone if you don't click right away. When I asked Janie how she decided how she had worked enough for one day, she explained that once she met financial goals was when she would finally allow herself to rest. If I need to make $50 to pay the rent, then I'll work 16 hours straight, whatever I need to do. But then there are those times when you don't get paid or your work is rejected, so you can't predict the time or the money really, but you do the best you can. Dawn is another Turker who lives in an economically depressed post-industrial US Rust Belt town and has been working as a digital piece worker for nearly 4.5 years. We used to have good union jobs around here, she told me, but those days have passed. Although she had long worked in a secretarial position, Dawn, like Janie, explained that she had embraced Turkey because she needed the flexibility to work when she can. Starting around the end of 2015, I had these illnesses that hit me overnight. No one knew what was wrong with me. I was ending up in the ER constantly. That's why I started Turking. I needed the flexibility. Even in trying to point to the good days, Dawn's narrative reveals how time in between work and family, time that could be spent recreating or in a state of leisure, is adulterated by the anxieties endemic to digital piecework. She says, I mean, there are days when you meet your goal by noon and I can concentrate on my family, like take the kids to the park or cook a nice meal or whatever. But then you wonder if you should spend time Turking because What if you come up short the next day or the next week? Is it okay to stop? I don't know. And then there are days when I'm so sick I can't work. When things were really bad, I would push through it. Like my heart rate would go up so high and I needed to go to the ER. And then I'd come back a few hours later and keep working. Sometimes I'd lay on the floor with my feet up and my laptop on my belly just to keep working while I waited for my heart rate to return to normal. The urgency to complete these tasks, even through health emergencies, is itself, I argue, a form of chronopolitics. Many digital peace workers live in a feeling of perpetual crisis. They must work quickly right now to make rent, to pay for groceries, to care for their children. And yet they have internalized what E.P. Thompson called the propaganda of time thrift, endemic to factory work. For example, in articulating the affective labor that most of the tasks require her to do, Dawn revealed how emotionally overwhelmed she would be by the work. But she framed these emotions not through their effect on her psyche, but through their impact on her time and her ability to earn. Like other Turkers, slowing down to think, relax, or recreate brought on feelings of guilt. The work can be really emotionally taxing, she said. Like this one project, I have to label things as hate speech. The things that you sit there and read are horrendous. And you think, people can't say these things. Or you'll do a survey that says, tell me the worst thing you've ever experienced. And I'm like, you want me to dredge up my worst memories and share them so I can feed my family? And it makes you feel so bad that you waste time thinking about things or staring into space, and then you can't meet your goals. And then you just feel bad for the rest of the day. For digital peace workers, time is enforced not through wage and hour laws or in-person bosses, but through piecework practices that enforce self-management. The speed demanded by the payment structures of their digital piecework melds in the minds and bodies of Turk workers with neoliberal ideologies to define what it means to feel worthy. Turking makes it possible to move frenetically between family and work, placing the responsibility of predicting one's wages, a mere impossibility, on the workers themselves, and simultaneously engineering an anti-welfare subjectivity. A sense that if they could do it on their own, and if they failed, well, that was on them. Dawn mentioned on more than one occasion that she preferred Turking to any form of state support. The other side of it is, she said, right now, if I were to file for disability, which is what my doctor wants me to do, and I have too much pride to do at the moment, they, the state, deny every case. And even if I get it, during those 2 years, you can't work. So you have to magically support yourself for those 2 years. It's not enough. So even though Turking is depressing work, it gives me a sense that I can contributing to my household. So I feel good about that. Close attention to the time politics of today's digital peace workers undermines the supposed individual choice, independence, and flexibility that piecework or digital piecework provide. Peace workers are casualties, I argue, not agents to the temporal orders of automation production and family care. I end this paper by exploring ways in which digital piecework can be formalized to account for all time laboring. A move to an hourly wage, for example, has the potential to not only introduce temporal autonomy into the work and family lives of people like Dawn and Jamie, it may also serve as a force of friction, slowing down the wheels of digital capitalism to address other political anxieties about the speed of automation and the future of work. Thank you.
We have some time for discussion now. Thank you very much. So who would like to start us off? Remember to unmute your mics. I think Cynthia, go ahead.
So I thought there was a really wonderful kind of complementarity and contrast between these two papers. So we see a much more positive depiction of a world that people like me in the pro-work community, pro-work side, tend to denigrate. And then on the other hand, a very depressing, although, you know, I mean, a little bit familiar depiction of the horrendous reality of a kind of work that people are driven to. And And I guess my question for both of you, and whoever wants to take it up, is therefore what? So slightly different versions of it. So Aleena, don't know where you would want to take this, and not that your paper needs to take this on, but where you want to take this with regard to the agenda of creating more work versus UBI. So in one sense, people are resorting to this world. It's an alternative, as you say. They're looking for things they can't find in works. And so maybe an answer to that is public job creation, reducing hours and spreading work. That's one way to approach it. The other is, hey, this is not so bad. Universal basic income would allow people to live a decent life while building their narrative through gaming. For Veena, I'm also wondering, okay, where do you go with this? Because I actually had a student, had a seminar, I've taught it now 3 times with Wilma Leuven, called Regulating Work Beyond Employment. And Amazon Mechanical Turk, and crowdsourcing is always a hot topic, and a student wrote a paper on how would you even go about regulating wages on Amazon Mechanical Turk? Or would you just ban it? Would you, try to go the same? I'm not quite sure how that would even be possible. Is it possible to regulate minimum pay without setting loose, obvious gaming, gaming the system? Would it work? Is transparency an answer, or is that just not really the problem? People do know what they're getting into. Maybe the solution, what to me, I'm driven to see both papers as different arguments for why we need to try to find ways to spread decent work. But I'm interested in what you all think about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond. Cindy, it's a great, wonderful question. So the part of this is a discrete project for me. I'm trying to keep it small, and not work on it for the next 10 years, like I have my other work. But one of the things that I've been looking at is the way that it actually came to this thinking about what were the sort of calls that collectives of Turk workers and different groups were kind of making, and unlike Uber and Lyft drivers, I didn't hear as many calls for the hourly wage, which sort of made me think about time in this context. I do think, so 2 things. One thing about the UBI, I have very ambivalent feelings about UBI for many reasons, but one central reason is sort of the global nature of this kind of work. So, Amazon Mechanical Turk started as primarily US-based work, and now it's US and India-based work. And one of the things that these workers are really afraid of is if they call for a minimum wage, that the work will then just be displaced to other English-speaking post-colonial contexts. And what I think a UBI would do is, of course, sort of make it possible for these people to hopefully continue to survive, but it also sort of doesn't account for the way in which all of the pressure then in the future of work lies in the global South in these contexts, and it creates this asymmetry or reifies this very extraordinary and extreme asymmetry between the West and the global South. So I have sort of an ambivalence about that. Interestingly, I do think that that hourly wages are much more possible on AMT than they are for like, say, how they were in the garment industry when they tried to regulate piecework. In fact, on AMT, Turkers have created scripts in which, and I have this sort of in an image in my paper, in which they actually install these sort of plugins, and it's a way to sort of regulate time for themselves, but they can see how much they're going to make per hour if they continue to work as fast as they're working, or the pace that they're working. And because of the surveillances of digital technology, it's much easier to actually trust workers when they say that they're working for an hour hour or for 2 hours or whatever. So I think I don't think that the question of paying through hourly wages is so crazy, both looking at this historically and looking at it from a digital possibility perspective. But I do think that we have to think about how that call really has to be one steeped in global labor standards and not just national labor standards.
Aleena, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Going to Cynthia's question about, where to take this agenda, towards, UBI or creating more work. I think that I don't think this is a either or sort of solution. I think, that there are multiple, routes towards, a different kind of future. I think we can consider both of them. But I think the important thing is sort of to really question the work ethic that's behind, or question this, this connection that we're placing on waged work, in relation to the work ethic and relation to this narrative of the self. It's not that we have to wholesale shift towards, something else. It's that, we have to slowly erode, because that's what it will take. It will take a slow erosion, right, of this sort of, of these ways of thinking. And it will take technical fixes, it will take social fixes, and it will also take narratives. These narratives are really important. We just think about how we imagine, a life history or a work history, right, through the image of a ladder, right? What if we could have multiple ladders? What if we could have multiple peaks instead of, the sort of the narrative arc that we're used to, right, with a climax and then a denouement? Perhaps we could think about it, in a different way. And I think that's really that's important. It sounds really mundane, but that's what life is made of. It's made of stories, And when I talk to my my participants, but also when I talk to my colleagues, right? Even though we study labor, we study work, at the same time, we hold ourselves to seemingly a different standard, right? That we don't understand that, we understand conceptually, but we don't feel it, and I think that's important. So Andrea Mulebach, I think she cited William Mozzarella, who said that for a change to be effective, it has to be affective. Before we tackle these sort of everyday structures, right? Before we tackle that underlying model, I think these other kinds of policies, these larger scale sort of implementations, I think they need to go hand in hand. And also, going back to UBI as a directional demand, right? I think that as Kathy Weeks has said over and over again, it's sort of, it's a long-term plan. It's a long-term sort of goal that will take, it will take decades, if not more, of implementation. And just sort of the push that it gives, the imaginary that it conjures, as a kind of utopia, I think for now, that is useful, and it will continue to be, at least in the US context.
Can I ask a question, Aleena? I loved your paper so much, and your work is totally fascinating. And I rarely think about, even when I think about game work, I'm thinking about like the game workers who are unionizing, and I sort of rarely think about the sort of pleasurable aspects of game work specifically. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the distinctions and the subjectivities, either as people shifted from actually playing the games to producing the games, or in how they talked about, or how your interlocutors talked about, what it meant, say, to be like a YouTuber versus what it meant to be a coder who worked 20 hours a day, or whatever. How they related to their work differently.
Right. So even amongst waged game workers, there's so much diversity in the tasks, and the roles. And it shifts all the time. You could be a designer, and then you could be one day, and then the next day, you could be retrenched and become a contract worker for the same company, for the same property, right? Or you could be a playtester, and they're like, there's hierarchies throughout. So when people think about game work, when people even think about games, right? It's it's not a unified sort of genre. It's not a unified process. There are indie games. There are AAA or blockbuster games, and the sort of the organizational practices are different. However, I will say that even indie games, speaking to Veena, what you mentioned about the the international division of labor, it has to account for even independent games. They do have processes, a lot of which are outsourced in different ways. The interesting thing about games, so this is your previous or your initial question, is about how that shift happens. That shift is constant, right? You're constantly shifting between organizing, so not labor organizing, but just organizing games. Those kinds of practices, right? To play something is to bring people together, especially for multiplayer games. Single player games, this kind of organizing also comes into play in terms of like fan communities, in terms of like online discussions. So I think it's really very much of a continuum, and it happens in games, but also throughout different kinds of media industries. That being a consumer and being a producer, it's not that clear cut. Okay, and I don't want to say it's hybrid, because I don't think hybridity is a useful sort of heuristic to think about this, because what hybridity does is that it legitimates flexibility, and who ends up picking up the slack. It's people, it's workers, it's consumers. So I don't think that's useful. These gray areas, right? Really, we need to think about the specificity, right, of each kind of different ways in which they overlap. And also I want to give a shout out to a scholar at U of T who is working on everyday game making. So this idea of how game making is not sort of it's not just done in studios, but it's done in everyday practices. I think that's something that's important to keep in mind. And thinking about this idea of diversity, actually, I want to, if I may, ask Veena something about whether or not you feel that it is useful to think about that diversity in different kinds of on-demand labor online, on these online platforms. So differences, say, between MTurk on one hand, and then Upwork, between these kinds of micro tasks and these kinds of macro tasks that are more team oriented, that have more complexity and more creativity. Do you see, is it useful, for you from a solidarity standpoint, but also for a conceptual standpoint, to see them as, as a kind of continuity?
Yeah, I think what you're asking me is a question that I've grappled with a lot. Like, is it useful to think of all of this as gig work, or is thinking is thinking about these sort of very different experiences and platforms and industries necessary? So two things. I think for a long time I resisted thinking about in-person service work and remote digital homework in the same sort of categories, because of the ethnographic work, their experiences are so very different. But I think from the perspective of solidarity, it is actually quite important and quite interesting to think about Uber drivers and and digital piece workers in the same conversations. And what I've learned more recently in bringing some of these Uber drivers who are organizing together with the AMT workers who are organizing is not only that they share sort of similar everyday problems, not just with work, but also with organizing, and actually think of themselves as similar types of workers. So in conversations that I put, because I do a lot of organizing myself and advocacy myself, I sort of brought some Uber drivers together with Turk workers to talk about how to have one-on-one conversations with their coworkers who are otherwise dispersed, and I was really sort of surprised and then sort of almost even emotionally overwhelmed at the ways in which they all identified themselves structurally as tech workers, not just gig workers, but specifically as tech workers. And so that what they were doing is that they were positioning themselves in a relationship of power to these sort of monopolistic industrial companies. And it's sort of, I didn't expect it because I was sitting here, I look at these narratives and my thousands of pages of conversations with workers, and I think, oh my gosh, this is so different. These experiences are so different. The sort of the affective masculinity and in-person service work versus the sort of the feminized homework of digital piece workers, and I see them so in sort of in granular detail as being quite different. But from the perspective of solidarity, it was fascinating to see how they felt structurally connected.
So we have about 4 minutes left before the next presentation. I think Valerio, you had a question you wanted to jump in, so keep that in mind. Go ahead.
Very, very briefly, I was, of course, very interested to this discussion, and I think something that emerged from both of your presentation is also a question of narrative, narrative that drives deregulation. If we think of the narrative around pin money, that has always been there when we discuss precarious work more at large, and I was wondering, how do you think we can counter the kind of narrative? Is it like we need to change the narrative to change the law, or is the law that needs to change the narrative?
Valerio, it's so lovely to see you. That's
great to see you.
Wonderful to connect, and it's such a good question. And my sort of life orientation is that law doesn't change except in response to demands. And so I very much think that it is the narrative that needs to drive the regulation and the future of how we think about this work in relationship to people's lives. And it's part of why I focus so much on individual narratives, on people's narratives of how they experience their work, because what you see here is not a narrative of flexibility. It is not a narrative of autonomy. It's a narrative in which people feel this frenetic, constant anxiety in which their lives are truly circumscribed and limited, as opposed to sort of freed through this labor. And so, what the interesting sort of what I was trying to do in comparing the garment labor and the sort of the way in which garment industrials talked about pin work to today's economy was to also show this sort of narrative shift. Even though it was about pin money then and it's about pin money now, the shift is actually which I think is steeped in deregulation, but in a complicated way, goes from, well, these women didn't need pin money because of the industrial family, because of the nuclear family, to now this is just pin money because for everyone, even though you don't have an external breadwinner or a single breadwinner in the family, because it supplements otherwise full-time work. And so just to see how the narrative shift, even though in both contexts it's about deregulation, how the narrative shift has sort of even, I hate to think of it teleologically, but has really even pushed people and gone further into the space in which leisure and pleasure is not only not possible, but really becomes sort of unnecessary.
Perhaps this would be a good occasion to move to the next presentation.
Am I allowed to sacrifice a minute or two of my own speaking time to ask a question of Veena and Aleena, actually? I'll take it out of my own time.
Okay, of course.
I'll sacrifice my paper for it. Veena and Aleena, thank you so much for some really, really interesting papers. Actually, when Cynthia asked a question and sort of brought up UBI, I was wondering whether you've already seen or have got any evidence about changes as a result of COVID. Because, of course, in some jurisdictions, what we're seeing at the moment is some form of introduction of UBI. And actually, we've seen quite a lot of work already on the labour market impacts of these different schemes. But have you seen specific impacts of these kind of COVID schemes on either people on Amazon Mechanical Turk or people, Aleena, in your paper, that are sort of working in that kind of gaming sphere?
So I'll tell you about this because I've been working on this nonstop, not the research, but actually trying to get people unemployment insurance. So for the AMT workers, there has been a decrease in good batches and a lot of fraud for some reason that's happening right now that I don't quite understand. And so there is quite a dependence on pandemic unemployment assistance. And it has been very hard for many people. There have been huge bureaucratic issues for people to access pandemic unemployment insurance. And so the people that I've talked to have continued to sort of they've been trying to working longer hours, and also sort of are very, very worried about, well, what's going to happen when this goes away come December. For the Uber and Lyft drivers, it's been like completely fascinating because they have not been able to access pandemic unemployment, and this is in California, insurance until recently, and it is so much less money than they would get as employees of Uber and Lyft. And because in the state of California, it is very clear that they're employees of Uber and Lyft, many of them, as a matter of true survival, are pushing to get state unemployment insurance, and 2 months in, they have none. So and so in terms of the effects on workers, on the sort of Uber and Lyft drivers, because they're trying to get UI, we have, and they're not working, it's been just sort of disastrous. There has been no UBI effect for the gamers. I'm sorry, not for the gamers. For the Turkers, it's been slightly better, but it's so little that it's still there's still an urgency to continue to do this work, even though there's so much less of it.
Yeah, I don't have any updated information on that, but I will say that with game players and game developers, right? There is a difference. It's not across the board, but because it is a primarily a leisure community, right? And because the demographic tends to skew, especially for the people that I study, tends to skew towards middle or upper middle class demographically. And a lot of these people, even though they are, adults dependent on their parents, they don't, I think it's a different kind of group than the kinds of people that Veena is studying. I think it's problematic that there isn't the same kind of diversity within this crowd, and I think that the voluntariness of it has to do is also plays a part in that. The fact that it's a kind of taste community. So I'll leave it at that for now.
I'll also say, Jeremias, that it's sort of hard to think about this as UBI because there's so much terror and death right now. And so the kinds of things that people, and it's occupational hazards, like with the gig workers, the in-person service workers that I work with, people being sick and dying, Uber and Lyft drivers. And so it's, even when people are finally able to get money, whether they're getting it through PUA or through state UI, they're using it for funeral services. And so or hospital services. And so it's really, it's hard to sort of draw analogies and thinking about UBI as this utopian sort of thing that we work towards in some sort of way to think about that in relationship to what's happening right now.
Great. So our next speaker, who has generously sacrificed his own presentation time, is Professor Jeremias Adams-Prassl from Oxford University Law. Take it away.
Thank you very much indeed, Igor, and thank you, Marcus, as well, for inviting me to join you today. The thing I'm going to talk about, and I think which tallies quite well with the presentation that Valerio is going to give following mine, is a particular facet of automation and the future of work that, amidst really important debates about the gig economy, has had slightly less, I think, attention so far, but is now, not least as a result of the increase in home working through COVID, becoming an increasingly important topic. And that's really what I sort of call the rise of algorithmic management, or the black box boss. So this is, for want of a better definition, essentially the idea that all the functions that employers traditionally exercised are slowly but definitely becoming automated, either completely replacing management, or at least in very significant ways augmenting the decision makers that managers would take. So if you wanted, as it were, in a quip, you could say lots of people, and I'm sure Cindy will tell us much more about this in an hour's time, worry about what happens when the robots are coming for workers' jobs. I think what this session is about is what happens when robots are coming for your manager's job. And again, that might sound quite attractive, right? All sorts of, most of us have had some sort of problem with the manager breathing down our necks. And so actually this idea that, great, a machine is going to replace her, doesn't sound that unattractive. But I think I want to sound various notes of caution, or at least, as suggested in the paper, I think there are three really important fault lines or challenges to the way we think of traditionally the legal regulation of the workplace that this brings up. And so what I want to do in my now ever so slightly shortened 20 minutes is three things, really. I'll just very quickly talk about first what I mean by this concept of algorithmic management, and just give you a couple of practical illustrations, and also some very recent illustrations of actually how COVID already in just 6 weeks, 8 weeks, has led to a huge explosion in terms of the rollout of these kind of tools. And then really, I want to spend some time thinking about these three fault lines, these three challenges. The first fault line being information, the second fault line being processing, and the third fault line being control, and how algorithmic management challenges our existing legal norms along those three fault lines. And then really, I think, just to conclude very quickly, I'll think about the sort of importance of agency when it comes to dealing with this. Because actually, again, even though in a sense right now it feels like this kind of technology is just something that's happening to us, actually there are loads of choices, lots of path dependencies that's now, despite everything else, more important than ever to think about. Okay, so let's start with this idea of what is algorithmic management? What is this rise? And essentially what it is a series of tools that originated in the gig economy. So lots of people, for example, will be aware of a feature that Uber uses in its app to measure how quickly drivers accelerate and how hard they brake. And drivers are then provided on a daily or weekly basis with their driving stats, where a little screen on their app shows them how smoothly they brake, how quickly they accelerate. And as you can imagine, if it's not a very good score, the drivers then get tips on how to improve. And if things don't improve, there will be an impact on their rating. Lots of the online work platforms also were early pioneers in terms of algorithmic management. So Upwork, for example, has a feature called the Work Diary, where if you want to do work digitally on Upwork, you have to install a little plugin on your computer that then takes a screenshot at random intervals every 10 minutes or so. And the client, the employer in a sense, can then have access to that work diary to see that, you know, while you were being paid to do some design work, you weren't actually doing your online shopping or playing around on Facebook. Now, again, what started out in the gig economy, and this I think is the really interesting phenomenon here, is now very quickly coming to workplaces across the socioeconomic spectrum. We don't necessarily talk about the algorithmic management. It feels a little bit like we're back in the early days of the gig economy, where everybody's still trying to work out what the label should be. People analytics, big data HR, those are the kind of labels under which this kind of software is developed and rolled out. And essentially what it means is that just about everything an employer would have traditionally done across the entire life cycle of the employment relationship, from its inception, selecting people, hiring them, to managing them on a day-to-day basis, all the way through actually to the termination of the employment relationship, those features or decisions can now be automated, or at the very least severely augmented through technology. So for example, when it comes to hiring, that's probably in the literature the best studied field so far. You can do everything from CV screening or social media reputation screens, all the way through to automated analysis of video interviews, where candidates, when they apply for a job, simply upload a video, That then gets analyzed with a score given to them. And the interesting thing is that these kind of technologies have now been rolled out and scaled up tremendously as a result of people working at home. So early on in the crisis, you saw a lot of companies, whether it's in the tech sector, in professional services, essentially most office-based jobs, very quickly starting to remote work the entire workforce, or the vast majority of the workforce. And with that came huge challenges to management. It's really interesting to read in the first week or two of the COVID crisis in different countries to see how managers were trying to struggle to cope with this. How do I manage my workforce from abroad? You had these stories of sort of managers forcing everybody to have Skype running continuously on their home computer, just so they could check that people were actually doing work. And then very quickly realizing that actually there was software available already to do that kind of management exercise in a much more sophisticated, much more fine-grained way. Lots of call centers, for example, early on being at the forefront rolling out this technology. The software called Cogito, for example, which helps workers have feedback on their performance on a live basis while on a call. Well, that's now a similar kind of software being rolled out to lots of homework scenarios. But even, for example, technology in warehouses is now being used for social distancing. Various big warehouse providers have started to use this kind of automated management software to monitor the whereabouts of workers in the warehouses in order then to be able to implement social distancing, and also in the jurisdictions that have adopted that approach to start getting involved with contact tracing. Again, leading to really, really interesting questions about how contact tracing through COVID-19 can be done in the workforce. So why should we worry about this? Or why should we rejoice about this? What are the kind of challenges that we have when faced with this kind of technology? Well, I think that's where we get these three fault lines, which I call fault lines because they really show a clear break with how management was traditionally exercised. And sometimes you get people sort of saying, well, actually, this is all just Taylorism, right? This is just a fancier version of Taylorism that has a nicer user interface and use a bit more data. But actually, I think if we look at those three fault lines, we see some seriously novel challenges for legal regulation. In terms of information, I think the big difference is the sheer amount of data available, right? Historically, you would have had some sort of survey data, perhaps from the workplace, from a manager sitting there. You would have baseline data from a CV, from an application, but that data was about it, and it couldn't very easily be linked up. So processing, that's where if you want artificial intelligence comes in, or more specifically, various kinds of machine learning algorithms that are used to analyze that data. And then in terms of control, we're moving very quickly away from a world in which your boss tells you what to do, and she sort of issues direct instructions to her workforce, to a world where we see all sorts of sophisticated nudging techniques, where we see all sorts of gamification and more sort of diffuse ways, but potentially even more effective ways of exercising control over the workforce. So in terms of data, I think the first big change we see is just how many different ways of collecting information we have. There's digital information, all the breadcrumbs and metadata, whether it's people's calendars, they show you who is meeting with whom, Slack, any kind of instant messaging software, any kind of mailing people back and forward. There's huge amounts of data who we interact with in terms of how productive we are in a measured sense available. There's physical data increasingly available through various sensors set out in offices. And there's also a huge world of self-tracking. Many of you will be aware, for example, with the work of my colleague here in Oxford, Gina Neff, who's done a lot of work on self-tracking. But actually, there's increasing amounts of employers who issue Fitbits to their workforce and then maybe even pay a bonus for that data to be shared with the worker. And I used to then say, well, actually, one of the dangers of this is that the traditional boundary between work and the home becomes completely blurred. Well, that's completely out of the window now, because there is no more boundary between home and work when increasing amounts of people actually sit at home and whilst they live in a life of care and duties and other obligations are also at work. And that kind of information that would have historically been recorded in the office on their office computer is now very often actually information on their personal device being recorded in their home, which has also become their workplace. And it's not just about having more of that data. The other important thing is the way that data is now structured and organized. It's structured and organized in a machine readable format, which means that actually even different kinds of data sets, different kinds of data sources can be combined and then analyzed as an overall big data package. The second big change, and I think quite closely relates to that, is the changes in processing. So we no longer use a sort of traditional algorithm in a lot of these things where you would have predictable inputs that then get factored in different ways, leading to a clear outcome in a decision tree, if you will. But we're relying on increasingly sophisticated machine learning techniques. And very crudely speaking, essentially what we're doing is we're moving away from a world of causation to a world of essentially spotting correlation. What machine learning does at its most fundamental in these contexts is it's trying to spot patterns in the data without necessarily, or indeed without even ever, understanding the actual content or meaning of these patterns, which makes it difficult to explain the decisions taken, which makes it very, very difficult at the end of the day to ascribe any kind of legal responsibility to the decisions that are taken. And finally, the third big challenge of fault line is this enabling of very different ways of exercising control. It's no longer simply your algorithmic boss replacing your traditional boss when she tells you what to do and when and how, though that software also exists, for example, when it comes to scheduling software. What we're increasingly seeing is these technologies being used to very subtly nudge workers. Again, a lot of the early work on the gig economy showed those kind of technologies in operation. Think, for example, of the work of Alex Rosenblatt and Luke Stark, showing how Uber used various of these technologies in conditioning the work environment through the app. And what we're seeing again is those kind of techniques of using various kind of behavioral hacks, of using various forms of gamification of the workplace, becoming much, much more potent, because through the machine learning techniques, essentially what you can now do is you can run pretty much an unlimited randomized control trial, learning from each iteration, and therefore then exercising even better and clearer control without necessarily ever being seen as explicitly issuing these kinds of instructions. Now, when it comes to thinking about how we should regulate this, I think it's very important that we also don't forget that there is potential in there, right? The human boss is not this perfect kind of, equanimous, always nice, kind person. We employment lawyers wouldn't be in business for a start if that were the case. There is lots of evidence that these kind of technologies could be used to have more efficient outcomes, to have more objective outcomes, to provide more neutral outcomes. No longer is there favoritism involved who sets the schedule if it's a neutral algorithm assigning the work. At the same time as highlighting these benefits, however, we also have to remember the various downsides of introducing algorithmic management. Lots of the downsides that have already been documented, for example, when it comes to issues of algorithmic discrimination, when it comes to issues of algorithmic explicability, where you may well very quickly end up, as happened, for example, in the case of Amazon, with trialing a new recruitment algorithm that's trained in your data of existing engineers, and very quickly decides that anybody who went to a women's college or university is not going to be hired because women don't fit the profile of your current engineers. So I think it's very, very important that we realize that whilst there are all these upsides, there's also very, very significant downsides. And I developed this more in the paper, which I think will be posted online shortly. There's some real challenges as to how existing legal frameworks can actually cope with these kind of technologies. When it comes to discrimination, for example, questions as to whether algorithmic discrimination is actually illegal under various legal regimes at the moment. Even worse, whether fixing it might actually be illegal, at least in US discrimination law, potentially also in European anti-discrimination law. And so I think that's really the challenge we've got ahead of us. I've got 1 minute left. And so let me just give you one example of how there can be a real clash at the moment between technical solutions and legal solutions. When it comes to algorithmic decision-making and hiring, for example, one way that's been shown to work mathematically quite neatly in terms of eradicating or minimizing bias is actually to use different kinds of constraints and classifiers for different groups within your population, i.e., to put it very crudely, to use one algorithm to hire one particular group with a protected characteristic and another algorithm to hire another group. Now, as any discrimination lawyer knows, that is absolutely illegal. Imagine walking into a bank and them saying, well, if you're a woman applying for this job, here's the computer, they'll do your assessment. If you're a man applying for the job, here's your computer doing that assessment. Absolutely illegal, even though technically it might actually be the best solution to the issue for the time being. So those are the kind of specific legal challenges I've got in mind. To conclude, I think, and this is my sort of general important refrain about the future of work, it's really important that we don't fall in the trap of thinking about there being any such thing as the future of work. There is nothing that's predetermined or sort of, universal, singularistic in determining what the path to the future will lead like. It's really important that we don't fall into sort of tech deterministic fallacies here that, this software just is the way it is and there's nothing we can do about it. What's happening in reality is that there are lots of choices involved in rolling out this software, lots of choices involved in designing what information is collected, lots of choices involved in how we then handle that information. And those choices are really where I think the sort of importance of legal regulation comes from. I have, if I were with you live, I'd show you on a slide now a patent application that Amazon filed a year and a half ago for a tracker to lead workers through warehouses. A tracker that's been reported in some very critical commentary to be used, for example, to buzz people around to tell them to speed up, right? Now, in the abstract, having a tracker that knows where worker is in the warehouse and shows her where the next item to pick is, isn't necessarily just a bad idea, right? If I just give you a list of items to pick in the morning and send you into a huge warehouse, it'd be much more efficient for you to have that guide through the warehouse that's worked out the optimum route. On the other hand, if that same software is then used to buzz you and push you to work harder and work out whether maybe it can put you into a sort of gamified competition with other workers to push you even further, well, that's obviously where things get much more problematic. But the crucial thing is the technology in that sense is neutral. It's our choices that conditions its deployability, where I think legal regulation needs to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremias. Our next speaker is Professor Valerio de Stefano from Leuven University, also law, and the title of his presentation is Algorithmic Bosses and How to Tame Them. Please take it away, Valerio.
Thank you, Igor, and of course, thanks also to Marcus for organizing this. And it's great to be with these wonderful colleagues and friends. It's really a treat. So Jeremias has set some of the contents that I think are relevant for the discussion on what he currently says are the futures of work. And I entirely agree with him when he says that this is about not just the quantity of the jobs that are going to be lost to automation, and we will be hearing from Cynthia about it in some time, but it's very much also about the quality of the jobs that will be staying. And this is a discussion that is less common, especially outside labor law circles. And the automation discourse is much more about how many jobs are going to lose, are going to be losing to sorry. Are we going to lose to the robots and softwares, etc. I think Jeremias already said something very meaningful on the devices that have been introduced in our workplaces. So I can basically piggyback on that and leave this description out. But what I want to say is that a very important thing here is about the narrative again. And the narrative of these technologies is in many cases detached from an analysis of the structural features of the contract of employment and of work relationship more in general. The contract of employment is not a neutral framework, and workplaces are not neutral environments. It's places where people are inserted in relationships that are based on legal authority of their bosses over the workers. So it's not just about a lack of bargaining power here, but it's the legal system that acknowledges and sanctions authority of a private party over another one. It's what Professor Elizabeth Anderson calls private government. Now, when we talk about these technologies, we really have to be scared about this form of private government, and we should not we should not neglect the fact that all these new devices magnify and enhance the managerial prerogatives of employers that are already quasi-dictatorial to a way that is almost dystopian. And of course, I see all the potential benefits also of some of this technology, and I won't ignore it. But I think the potential benefits are much more highlighted already in the mainstream discourse. But the point is, we are seeing something that is unprecedented in the past. And I totally agree with Jeremias on that. I and Jeremias went around for many years talking about the gig economy and saying, this is nothing new. This is really nothing new. It's casual work. It's forms of precarious work that have always been there, and the technology is just there to give a shiny appearance to this, but it's really nothing new. And instead, in this case, we're seeing things that are completely unprecedented, and they scale up the managerial prerogatives and powers of employers in ways that are uncontrolled. It's not just, again, about the amount of data that is collected and processed second by second. It's also about the continuity of this monitoring. So you never have a break, and there is no human boss or manager or supervisor that can constantly have an eye on someone, but actually these new technologies allow a constant surveillance that will increase stress level and possibly drive down productivity at the end of the day. So it's not just about a question of worker protection, but it's also a question of what kind of businesses do we want around. At the same time, the scope of control is unprecedented. We always had the stories about bosses wanting to check what employees do in their private lives. But again, the idea of someone using a microphone that I wear on my badge to monitor my pitches in my voice, to monitor my emotions, to use facial scans to detect whether I am lying or not, even if all these systems were reliable, and we know that they are not. In many cases, they are flawed. In many cases, they are biased and racially skewed and gender skewed. They are programmed in many cases with a certain type of worker in mind. Well, even if we could rely on these systems and we could really think that they weren't flawed, this will be extremely problematic. There is no reason why managers should know about my emotions even before I know about them. And this is actually what this kind of technology wants to put in place. Is what Professor Dubal calls surveillance capitalism, and this is surveillance capitalism on steroids. At the same time, the discrimination and the flawed rating that I can get from a single interview can follow me for the rest of my life. We should not be we should not forget that not every employer is Amazon. Not every employer has an army of programmers that are able to go and detect the flaws in the algorithms. Most of employers buy or rent the software from outside companies, and they had absolutely no idea of what's going on in the algorithm. I mean, Jeremias was talking about the black box and the question of machine learning and the fact that there is no accountability of these algorithms. And there is even less accountability if we think that a lot of employers buy or purchase these things from outside companies and have no control whatsoever on what they put in their own management line. So again, this is another thing that is completely different from the past. And at the same time, and this is another thing that's, it's another problem of narrative. Technologies are very easily presented as neutral, as driven by maths, are driven by science, whereas we all know, and I mean, there's a lot, of course, of literature already out there about algorithmic discrimination, but at the same time, we tend to underestimate the risk of biases inserted in the algorithms and the risk of, first of all, scaled repercussion, and second, of feedback loops that marginalize and over-marginalize already vulnerable groups. So this is something that we should not forget when we discuss about these things. So I think that we really have to have a discussion on how to tame all these new technologies. And of course, again, there's some benefits that we can reap out of this. Of course, a system that controls the heartbeat or the level of attention of someone can be extremely important in some profession, for instance, in truck driving. And that's something that alerts you when you are falling asleep, for instance. That would be for sure something extremely important. And when you carry out hazardous jobs. But at the same time, we should not be fooled. At the moment, this is not the driver. At the moment, the driver is about control and oversight and creating data and sharing data to monetize this data beyond the scope of the single work arrangement. I have argued in the past, and I think it's particularly important that we rediscover the collective dimension when we talk about the future of work. We can have a lot of legislation around this thing, but legislation is too rigid, is too slow to react. What we need is much more flexible and day by day bargaining and negotiation over this. And of course, in some countries, this is going to be much more complicated because there's no collective bargaining at the workplace. Most of the workplaces are not unionized. And in those cases, we really have to think about what we can do to test and trial the algorithms before they're put in our workplaces, whether to think of external authorities and other things of the sort. But I think where collective bargaining is existing and there is a tradition of information and consultation when new technologies are introduced, and this happens in many countries in Europe, for instance, this information and consultation should also concern the content of the algorithm. And I know that a big part of the allure behind the algorithm is the black box, and people see the black box as something that is positive, but we cannot allow this in our workplaces. We cannot give the destiny of our lives in the hands of the black box. This is something that we will never allow and accept in any other aspects of our lives. So there is no reason why we should do that with employment. At the same time, when we talk about collective labor law, one thing that we should not forget is that many of the workers that are already concerned by these changes are traditionally outside the scope of collective labor law because they are misclassified or classified as independent contractors. And many platform workers are already subject to management by algorithm. Jeremias was saying that. And at the same time, we see a pushback from some antitrust authorities to try and narrow the scope of collective bargaining as much as possible to the employment relationship, to the traditional subordinated employment relationship. And I think the need to counter the managerial prerogatives of employer and this over enhancement of these prerogatives could be an argument to enlarge the scope of collective bargaining and enlarge it to a broader audience of people than what we have so far. I would have something else to say, but I really want to leave the open space for debate. So I will stop it now, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Valerio. I thought to exercise chair's privilege and maybe ask Jeremias a question. I thought it really fascinating that there's this feature of automated bosses or automated management. And it made me think a little bit about the old work of Eric Olin Wright, the sociological theorist and political theorist. And he talked about contradictory class locations because managers, after all, are also workers. They typically don't have control over capital. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit about this relationship, those who own, those who control. That would be very helpful. Also, in terms of bargaining, right? How do you get the workers together to push back against, these algorithmic developments? So I'll keep it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor. And in a sense, you've precisely put your finger on actually a sort of weak point in employment law, because actually what employment law has always done is assumed that the firm is a black boss. And actually employment law has always, because otherwise it just gets too messy from a practical perspective, employment law has always assumed that any manager anywhere in the hierarchy, if she discriminates against you, for example, even if, as it were, senior management has said, don't do that, we still ascribe that responsibility. Now, in the context of algorithmic management, I think where that gets most important in the literature is when people start talking about the role of the human in the loop. Because actually one of the sort of solutions that's frequently mooted and proposed, and is also in some legal regimes, for example, in the European Union, in the GDPR, is that when you're being subjected to an automated decision under the GDPR, there needs to be a human actually involved in that, right? So it's really interesting that the law tries to sort of countermand this complete replacement of authority through the involvement of human. Now, the reality is, when you look at a lot of the sort of anthropological and sociological studies of how these, sort of complete technological systems then end up working, is that human in the loop will very rarely have any kind of real authority. Or even if she does have real authority, will be very careful to exercise it. So the studies done, for example, that the two biggest studies are done on very opposite ends of the labor market, radiologists on the one hand, and people doing the airport security checking on the other. And there's a couple of really interesting findings about sort of authority. So when it comes to radiologists who are, sort of very experienced at the end of the career, not necessarily unconfident people, when faced suddenly with predictions from an algorithm, very often will just allow that automated judgment to overrule their own without, sort of exercising any kind of autonomy. At the other end of the labor market, with the automation of a lot of airport screening, it turns out that actually, in terms of watching out for things going wrong, monitoring for faults, which will be a security threat in the airport context, but say algorithmic discrimination in the workplace, it turns out that the combination of human and machine is actually the worst possible outcome. The machine by itself is better, as is the human by itself, than the combination of the two together. So I think in terms of then, you add to this, these hierarchies in the employment relationship, and Valerio sort of brought that out, right? And for a long time in employment law, we've been thinking about how the contractual structure sort of camouflages this reality of the inequality of bargaining power. I think what algorithmic management does is it grossly exacerbates a lot of these kind of theoretical dimensions and the sort of power dynamics we see in the relationship, precisely because the technology doesn't sit by itself, but it sort of, knocks off a lot of the other equilibria in terms of the broader socio-technical system of management within the enterprise.
Go ahead, Veena.
I wanted to just say one thing and to actually talk about the question that you asked, Igor, and then to pose a question to Valerio. You asked Igor, how do you get workers to sort of organize against this? And I think it's such a good question, but I think the answer is that workers are already organizing against this. You see in the US tremendous sort of cross-sector organizing against algorithmic management, from Amazon to Uber drivers to AMT workers, especially actually during this COVID moment, that even though this has become so so ubiquitous, it has not yet become normalized. I am concerned, however, and this goes to my question to Valerio, about it becoming normalized very quickly. I remember 10 years ago sitting in a taxi company's office, and they were watching looking, they were showing drivers how they could tell how fast they were going, and the drivers were really angry about it, that they could tell, that the taxi companies could tell how fast the drivers were going, and everyone was sort of pissed off and talking about how they were gonna protest and strike if the companies didn't take away the practice. And now, I mean, it's just an everyday part of life that that Uber drivers are monitored in that way, and there's very little to no resistance against that particular practice. But and so, given how quickly this stuff becomes normalized and internalized and part of self-management, and in addition to employment management, Valerio, I was so pleased at the end of your paper and the end of your talk where you talk about the importance of collective bargaining, because I don't think that that regulations are going to solve this in time or very quickly. And I've been very disappointed in the US with large US unions in terms of how they've been thinking about or not thinking about algorithmic management. And I wonder whether you know empirically how collective agreements have accounted for this in the European context, or how they are talking about accounting for this.
First of all, thanks a lot to both of you for the excellent questions. I think, as Veena is saying, we see a pushback already, and this pushback is in the tech sector, but it's also at the shop level in warehouses, and we see many shop unions reacting to the algorithm. Also because a lot of people get fired by the system, and they lose their jobs, and for basically no reason, or if you ask the supervisor why they were fired, they wouldn't even know. So I think one way of avoiding that these things get normalized is to explain how different it is from traditional monitoring. Now, one thing is to say that taxi drivers are monitored when they go too quick. A completely different thing is to say that a buzzer starts buzzing if I go to the toilet, or if I talk with someone else, or the chip controls the tone of my voice, and all these kind of things. So we have to invest time in explaining how different it is, and actually how we could put some of this technology to good use if we restrained it. And it's not just about renouncing the benefits that this technology can get us in terms of better safety and also better productivity. I mean, if you ask some people, they're perfectly happy that some programs help them stay focused, but I don't know whether they know that basically all the browsing activity gets transferred to the managers, and also the question about how to make sure that all this is done in a transparent way. So what unions I know have acted on this have done is asking for transparency in the criteria, asking that the criteria of production are set at a human level, that the computer don't set too stressful workplaces, and that the officer and the supervisor still are in the chain of command when it comes to take decision. But as Jeremias was saying, this might be even more problematic than having the two things working separately. So this is something that also needs attention from us. So what I've seen is in Amazon warehouses across Europe, unions asking what goes into the algorithm, how what data are collected, and how they are processed. Now, I have to say that in Europe, we also have a long tradition of bargaining over new technologies introduced at the workplace. It's something that probably doesn't resonate as well in the US, but there are laws and even a European directive that mandates information and consultation when new technologies are introduced at the workplace that can have detrimental implications on working conditions. And beside you, we also have in many countries, in Germany, in France, in Italy, since ever, legislation that basically tries to tame supervision. The problem here, and I'm not going to say that Europe is like the perfect world, because the problem here is that in many cases, it's very easy to introduce these forms of surveillance, concealing them from the workers and the unions. It's not just putting a camera that everybody sees. If you give me a laptop that does a tracker, and I don't know about the tracker, it's very likely that I won't know that I'm surveilled. And at the same time, you can discipline me for many other reasons. And if you want to target me because because I'm not meeting the metrics, it's easy to conceal a disciplinary action behind other reasons. It's a problem of balance. It's a problem of attuning what the existing legislation says. And the existing legislation is there, provides for a good protection, provides for good ideas, involvement of unions, etc., but it's far from being sufficient at the moment.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
Thanks so much for these, again, really complementary and very interesting papers. Both, but especially Valerio's paper and his last set of comments make me think about a question of transition or temporality, something about the timing of the introduction of both surveillance technologies, algorithmic control mechanisms, but also automation and replacement of humans. Because there's a fair bit of evidence, I think, that new technology, including technology that replaces human labor, is being introduced by new entrants into a particular sector that exist. Incumbent workers have, in Europe, they have some legal protections against dismissal, mass dismissal, individual dismissal, algorithmic dismissal, for example. They have participation rights with respect to new technologies, and that can sort of slow things down, provide some traction for incumbent workers to resist the introduction of these new technologies. But the problem is the churn in the industry, creative destruction. One problem is that if new entrants come in, gain a competitive advantage by taking advantage of technologies that existing companies had not thought to use, or surveillance technologies, so workers sign on to a regime that includes certain technologies, a lot of those legal tools fall away. They're not very useful. And over time, we will see a gradual increase in both surveillance and automation, that the law has much less, it's harder to come up with tools to resist them. So I guess I wanted your thoughts on that.
Valerio, do you want to go first?
Sure. Cindy, thanks so much. First of all, it's great to see you. So thanks so much. I think there's a problem of the transition, as you say, and one thing will be the incumbent workers, and one thing will be the newcomers, and the incumbent companies and the newcomers. Now, when I think to collective bargaining, again, this is a very European perspective, but I also think to sectoral collective bargaining, that I think helps in spreading the protection beyond the single workplace. And of course, and I think there is this when I talk about sectoral collective bargaining, somehow there's this misconception that it cannot go hand in hand with shop-based bargaining at the workplace level. Of course it can, and of course it does. But I think we need a layer of different form of regulation. And I think of a general regulation that stems out of legislation that also sets default rules and a default oversight from a public authority on some of these practices when no collective bargaining exists. And then we go down to sectoral collective bargaining and to shop-based collective bargaining, because I mean, if you only focus on company-based collective bargaining, there's workplace that will never see that in Europe as well as in the United States. So I am thinking of a layered approach to regulation in this case.
So in terms of normalization, that really interesting point you make, Cindy, first struck me when I was just sort of casually talking to some of my students about these new technologies, and I just come across the whole completely automated video interviewing for the first time, and I expressed what you might call, you know, some serious reservations / you know, extreme horror at this idea, and they seemed entirely nonplussed by this. And hello, Veena's got some friends in there. And so it's we're just talking about generational shifts, Veena, and how a lot of my students actually, when faced with these kind of surveillance technologies, are not that particularly worried about it because they're in a sense conditioned to living in this workplace, right? And actually there again, you have this sort of thing where how do you then design legal frameworks around this? Right. And so one big problem with the GDPR, for example, is that it still very much uses consent as the key principle for the introduction of these technologies. And so, yes, from a European perspective, it might look like the GDPR is actually a good device for regulating this. But actually, when you look at the practice of it, given the actual legal mechanisms then used, consent being a key one, which, you know, sort of labor law 101, we know, and given all the power structures in the workplace, is not going to work particularly well. Actually turns out that it doesn't do much more than create a very, very basic sector of standards. One way around that, as Valerio has pointed out, and really I think sort of in the collective dimension, is various forms of collective bargaining organization. I think another way around is to also work directly with the developers and the providers of these softwares, right? I think another sort of dimension that's missing from this debate is we think about it as this sort of employer-employee relationship, but as Valerio and others have pointed out, a lot of this software is not designed in-house but bought in. And so you then, for example, think about the work of people like Lilia Rani, who's done a lot of work thinking about how developers of software perceive the subjects that are then sort of, you know, actually exposed to their products. And I think that's another really important regulatory angle and aspect to this, which then helps with that normalization and it's sort of rolling out into the workplace.
Go ahead, Aleena.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much for both your talks. I have a question for both of you, but I think speaking directly to the human of the loop that Jeremias talked about. So what if your manager is another on-demand worker? So, you know, from a customer support representative in the global south, right? In a situation like that, you know, like and this relationship or this managerial relationship is mediated by algorithmic processes, you know, what kind of, you know, can you speak to the complications, but also the opportunities that comes through, you know, through that kind of interaction?
Happily so. And I think there's two different ways of, or sort of two different contexts of this. So MTurk actually used to use this a lot for quality control early on. So what MTurk used to do is when there was a dispute between a requester and an MTurker, sometimes they would actually just put the resolution of that dispute as another task on the platform. So essentially what they do is they, you know, you had your fight over your one set task and they just pay somebody else a cent to essentially resolve that dispute. My sense is that that's sort of now been discontinued. What we're actually seeing today is very frequently that the first layer of dispute resolution is very often completely automated. Right. So, for example, if a worker in a lot of gig economy platforms complains about something, or indeed if a passenger complains as well, actually the sort of first response you get to that is completely automated without any kind of human being in the loop. And it's only then at the second stage, if you manage to escalate it somehow, that human becomes involved. And so I think that's a really interesting sort of dimension you actually get often in the first level, in the first instance, particularly as it were with jobs at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. There frequently won't be a human in the loop at all. And again, Veena, I'm sure will be able to tell us more about different kinds of field work. You know, so the frustrations you, for example, get with gig economy drivers when something has gone wrong and the sort of complete impossibility of contacting any kind of human being. I think sort of being treated, at least in principle, by a human in the loop actually will increasingly become a privilege of a higher status and higher socioeconomic powered professions. right? Where if you are a lawyer in a firm and something goes wrong at home and you come in late, you'll probably always have some form of human. You can say, well, this is what happened and went wrong. Whereas if you're working in a warehouse, chances are the algorithm won't care, and there'll be no way of actually explaining it to the algorithm.
Valerio, do you want to jump in?
Yes, just to say that even now, without, and even before these automated forms of supervision were introduced, there's people, and the gig workers are a blatant example, that don't have access to a supervisor, either automated or not automated. I mean, even before they introduced these chatbots, etc., people knew that when they were kicked out of the platform, it would be extremely difficult for them to fight the decision, no matter who sat at the other part of the table, an algorithm or not. And as Jeremias was saying, I think that the idea of interacting with a human supervisor more and more is going to become a privilege for people in the upper part of the labor market, and the lower tiers of the labor market will have to we'll have to deal with this kind of algorithmic management more and more. If I can also say something, because we discussed algorithmic discrimination at length, I think there is excellent work that has been published recently by Ifeoma Jumba at Cornell, that I encourage anyone to look at. And of course, when we talk about the voice of precarious work and of gig workers, there's all the work that Veena has published so far that it's extremely relevant as well.
I was wondering, maybe with 4 minutes left, we take a question from some of our YouTube viewers. In particular, here's an open question: why would AI managers owned, controlled by the firm be allowed when AI managers could be owned and controlled by the individual worker or workers? Does anyone want to take that up? I could reread it again very quickly. Why would AI managers owned and controlled by the firm be allowed when AI managers could be owned and controlled by the individual workers? So it's a pro workers owned bosses.
I go with that. I have no answer. I think if I had to choose, and if I had the possibility, I would rather not be controlled by an algorithmic boss at all. So whether owned by me or by someone else, I think I'd rather skip it.
Anyone else?
I think I just agree with my learned friend.
Oh, I think Veena here, because that's how capitalism works. Is that a descriptive claim or a normative claim?
An empirical claim.
Empirical, okay, so more descriptive. All right, well, I think we could use the extra time now to move forward to our next presentation. So our next presenter is Professor Cynthia Estlund from NYU Law. And the title of her presentation is Why Work is a Social Good and Freedom is Overrated. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. Thanks again for putting this together and coping with all the challenges of virtual conference. This is my first one, actually, and I'm very impressed with how smoothly it's going. So I've been an earlier phase of my work, 20 years ago, really, the core of my work was then about the socially integrative function of the workplace, particularly in a diverse society. This was in the immediate wake of bowling alone, and it was about the underappreciated social integrative function of work, in particular as compared to voluntary associations, which are the kind of heartland of civil society. So I published that book in 2003, Working Together, went on to a variety of different things, but it has recently seemed that work has seemed to me, and those ideas have seemed to me to be newly relevant in the context of concern about automation and automation replacing workers and yielding net job losses over the foreseeable future, and universal basic income as one of the more popular discussed responses. In other words, okay, if we're going to face job losses, let's give people money so that they don't need jobs. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time at all on the very hotly debated question of whether we are or are not looking at net job losses. I think I've looked very closely that just recently, that's the part of my book that I've been working on. I would recommend to anyone who's interested in this, the single most persuasive account I've seen that integrates both the technology side and the economics. And I think Igor might share this view, I'm not sure, is Daniel Susskind's very recent book on this. And he makes a very persuasive claim and shows how the economists both are and are failing to kind of appreciate this, that there is almost certain to be a gradual process of task encroachment. The technological capability of performing tasks, not in the way that humans have done them sometimes in very different ways, but that gradual process of task enforcement is going to lead to gradual but inexorable job losses. Now, I don't want to be accused of technological determinism, but I think we have to be wary of the opposite problem of not appreciating what's going on in technological developments that really feed into the existing dynamics in a market economy to drive over time the replacement of human labor. But okay, that's a very active debate. My basic posture is we don't know, but it's likely enough that we need to think ahead, think about it. And so I am confronting and interrogating my own attachment to work. I am very persuaded by the very large literature on the psychosocial benefits of work. Work as a sense of identity, even work that people think is bullshit, that they don't think is meaningful, they still find it a source of identity. I think that Aleena's paper was really interesting about people's need for this sense of identity that they have traditionally gotten through work. That's one thing. I support that. I find it persuasive, but I'm making a very different argument. It is similarly consequentialist. It's about it's not an argument about the intrinsic value of work so much as it is the consequences of work as a social phenomenon especially in a diverse society. It's an argument for trying to construct social policies that keep work at the center of most adults' lives. And paradoxically, the argument is that the good that work does socially is not just in spite of the economic and organizational compulsion that is at the heart of our critiques of work, it's actually partly because of those things. So I start with what I hope is some fairly common ground, and that is that any self-governing society, maybe any functioning society at all, but certainly any society that aspires to be self-governing needs some sort of substrate of social connectedness and connections, some sort of diffuse links, the sum total of which create a sense of being in this together, of belonging to the same community, of having problems that we need to solve together. So associations and cooperation and interaction among people, we need to have spaces where that happens that are not within the family, where people are born into a certain group, not among their friends that they choose, but among what's called strangers, and especially across social divisions. Okay, why paid work? In particular, why not celebrate the decline of paid work and the opportunity to spend more time in voluntary associations. So the argument, which I'm really compressing here in the interest of saving more time for discussion, is that both the economic and the organizational compulsion that are characteristic of work relations they help to keep people in it. They keep people sticking with it, continuing to engage, trying to work through conflict, friction, and with people that they neither grew up with nor did they choose to associate with, to stick it out and learn how to cooperate across the inevitable and sometimes, very socially destructive frictions that exist. That is especially important given that, and this is another hotly contested, it's contested, but actually I think the evidence is overwhelming that the workplace, when you compare it to other sites of association, is comparatively diverse. Perhaps more importantly, it's a space where we have some tools, some willingness, and some normative commitment to making workplaces more diverse, to breaking down exclusionary and discriminatory barriers. And so unlike families, unlike groups of friends, unlike, so neighborhoods, interesting reasons why anti-discrimination law has less traction in residential segregation than in workplace segregation. Certainly in voluntary associations, many of which are insulated from the possibility of regulation. And so the workplace is a space where people kind of have to get along together enough to get the work done. And that's partly, and they manage to do that partly because of the economic compulsion to stick with a job, and in part because of the organizational compulsion to get past your differences enough to get work done. I really, really don't want to romanticize workplace relations. There's lots of problems. I don't want to be too optimistic about what the law has done so far, for example, to combat discrimination and harassment. I want to argue that we have tools, we have seen enough progress over the last many decades to be, I feel pretty confident that the workplace is the best place we have for that, and that in particular, as compared to voluntary associations, there's just a lot more to work with in cultivating that the working together, cooperation, and forming connections across those lines of division that people, when they're left to their own devices and they're left to their own voluntary associations, might tend to avoid crossing. This is particularly, I think this connects, although I'm not entirely sure, I think this connects with Igor's paper about politics. So workplace relations, being in the same job, sometimes even if you're not literally face-to-face, working together, tends to create common interests, just common concerns, both positive interests in advancing the purposes of the organization, but negative interests, grievances, concerns about how work is organized, concerns, all the things that we were talking about, for example. So it creates common interests. And then the process of working together itself creates a kind of potential, a sort of superficial level of cooperation and getting along. And the combination of those things historically has been by far the most fruitful source of solidarity. And when workplaces are diverse, in particular when collectively organized workplaces are diverse, the possibility for solidarity across group boundaries is something that we see in every union organizing drive today. We saw it historically, and there are reasons to be concerned about changes that are taking place in the nature of work. There are reasons to think that that old forms of organization of work might have been more favorable to creating this experience. But we see that working together, working in a common occupation with common concerns is a source of solidarity and a source that can be built up from the workplace level all the way up to the highest level of politics to mobilize people for changing their life, changing the way society works. And that seems to me, I'm writing something else that focuses on this aspect of it. Seems to me indispensable nowadays with the kind of polarization of political, but also racial and ethnic polarization that is infecting our politics, to do the most we can to cultivate that one space where we have common interests that cut across these identity group lines. So all of this leads me to be skeptical, although not irreconcilably hostile to arguments for universal basic income. I don't mean to say this is the one and only and necessarily most important thing to think about in the social debate. And there are lots of good arguments for universal basic income, in particular the availability of a walkaway option. That's a good thing. The ability to say, no, I'm not putting up with this anymore. That's a good thing. I introduce a little bit of ambivalence into that by pointing out that sometimes it's good to have to stick it out. So it makes me anxious about the sort of utopian anti-work arguments that are quite common among advocates of universal basic income. And it does make me especially anxious about the future of less work, because if we don't do anything, not sort of unprecedented, but something very ambitious to spread the loss of work, what we're going to have is a growing pocket of people dropping out altogether. Some people will be working very long hours because their skills will be in high demand and their marginal returns will be very high. And more people will just be dropping out of the active labor force. That seems to me a social disaster, a political disaster, something we should work very hard to avoid. And so I think I end up very much in the same programmatic space as Igor does, and he'll talk about the strong commitment to spreading work by figuring out ways to reduce hours per worker. I would say in the American context, we have a way to start on this that is easier than I think the challenging project of reducing work weekly hours, and that is, how about paid vacations? We don't have any mandate for paid vacations. Paid leave, paid sick leave, we don't have that, and the recent pandemic crisis has highlighted the social spillover effects of that. But so paid sick leave, paid family leave, paid vacations, all things that are completely normal and taken for granted in most of the developed world, those are should be at the top of our agenda in terms of starting to spread work out. I think inevitably we're going to come to the more challenging project of how to reduce working hours, and then we'll have to think about what's the right amount of work. To the extent we have choices about, instead of 100 years ago, we didn't have these choices. To the extent we have choices about how much work people have to do, how much they should be expected to do, we should be thinking about how much work is enough. And I point at the end of the paper to a study that Jeremias at an earlier conference pointed me to. Wonderful study that takes on the question of the dosage effect. So what does that mean? Dosage. How much sunshine is good for you? More, it's good, but more is not necessarily better. Certain medicines, more is not necessarily better. Similarly, obviously with work, more hours of work is not necessarily better. That's what the whole 8 hours movement, before that, the 10 hours movement, before that, the 12 hours movement was about emphasizing you can have too much of a good thing. And so that movement to reduce hours of work, to reduce the work week, kind of stalled out, at least in the US, less so in Europe. This was a movement on that, kind of stalled out at a 40-hour standard work week. But I think we need to think about what's the right mix, what should we be shooting for? And it might be a lot less than 40 hours a week. I think the study that I mentioned before, that I talk about in the paper, found some evidence that psychosocial benefits of work plateau at about 8 hours per week. So I think I very much doubt that the social societal benefits of work plateau at such a low level, nor do I think it's possible that we could find out a way to measure the to really quantify the social political benefits of working together. But I think that's the kind of thing we need to start thinking about over the long haul, in preserving work at the center, not as much of it, but enough to keep people engaged in this social project of building a common society with a common fate. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Cynthia. I guess I should reintroduce myself as I'll be presenting next. So I'm Igor Shoikhedbrod, a postdoctoral fellow in the ethics of AI at the Center for Ethics. And I'll be presenting a paper on re-politicizing and revaluing work in the age of automation and AI. And so my paper takes as its starting point the ethical implications of automation and AI through a critical dialogue between normative political theory and political economy as regards the value of work. I will begin by briefly sketching the genealogy of value discourse and how it connects to the future of work. And then I will ultimately argue that the meaning of work should be revalued and politically contested in the age of automation and AI. I should say as a disclaimer, I'm also pro-work, but the devil's in the details. And so it really depends on what kind of work we're talking about in this future society and how we choose to distribute it. Rather than calling for the abolition of work and resigning to what I think is an abstractly conceived basic income, priority should be given to reducing working time through regulatory constraints that are arrested politically. Such a reduction in necessary working time should also coincide with a diversification of the range of skills and activities that are performed by human beings in the age of automation and AI. But none of this can be done without revaluing and repoliticizing the future of work. So in the first part, I want to talk about this genealogy of value discourse. The value of labor was at one point considered the terra firma of economics, which still regards labor as but one commodity among others, varying in degrees of scarcity and price. However, there exists a richer, older, more expansive tradition in the history of moral philosophy and classical political economy, stretching from Aristotle and Kant through Smith, Mill, and Marx, which engages substantively with labor and its values. In his Politics, for example, Aristotle famously distinguished between two kinds of value, use and exchange. The first sees value in qualitative terms, that is, value is conceived in terms of how well an object performs a specific use for human beings and the extent to which it satisfied concrete human needs, or the need to be needed, as Jeff Noonan points out in his work. The latter conception, exchange value, is quantitative, and it captures the monetary worth of an object, which is usually expressed in the form of a price. We're more familiar with the latter conception of value. Another important thinker, Immanuel Kant, introduced distinction concerning value in his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. And what he did was to distinguish between two such conceptions, value and price, and worth and or dignity. I'm not going to mention the German words, but we can talk about that later because it does have significance. The difference between value and worth for Kant boiled down to the broader question of whether an object under consideration can be appraised. At its most consistent, Kant concludes that human beings as such cannot be appraised and hence are priceless. His understanding of value rests on the deeper claim that human beings are owed dignity because they possess immeasurable moral worth. So you can't put a price on them, you can't put a quantitative price on them. It is to Kant's great credit that he anticipated a modern society of rights bearers that could indeed be treated with legal respect while still serving instrumentally as means to others' ends. The society of modern rights bearers that Kant anticipated is one in which the dominant relation between human beings is mediated by the production and exchange of commodities on the market, which brings us to labor and its values. In Das Kapital, Marx drew on Aristotle's original distinction between use and exchange value to capture the peculiar character of labor under capitalist production more specifically. Labor is at once concrete and abstract, qualitative and quantitative. This is because laboring activity or work is oriented towards fulfilling concrete human needs. At the same time, most forms of work are monetized, which means that regardless of qualitative differences between different lines of work, all forms of work can be subjected to the same abstract measure of value, price. Nowadays, wages and salaries are said to reflect the relative scarcity of skills and the demand for them on the market. So this is definitely in opposition to the labor theory of value. However, at the time when John Locke, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and Karl Marx were writing, labor was still regarded as the primary source of value. Marx differed from his predecessors in his identification of the dual character of labor, use and exchange, and its exploitation by capital in the sphere of production. Marx further demonstrated that laborers produce more than the time for which they are paid, and he referred to this phenomenon as the extraction of surplus value. While Marx brought to bear the alienating and exploitative character of labor under capitalism, he continued to regard labor power as potentially transformative, liberating, and intrinsically valuable. In his later work, I have in mind the Grundrisse, Marx looked forward to social arrangements in which the most harmful and mundane forms of labor would be automated under a process of what he called associated production, leaving emancipated producers, workers to engage in more creative activities that could be pursued as ends in themselves. Nevertheless, he maintained that the pursuit of these freedom-enabling activities would still be grounded in the realm of necessity, thereby preserving a sphere for economically necessary labor, even in the emancipated society of the future. Contemporary proponents of post-work and full automation often sidestep this crucial dimension in Marxist thinking between emancipating and abolishing work. I am in favor of the former. By characterizing labor power as potentially creative and freedom-enabling, Marx departed from the views of his predecessors, including Adam Smith here, who saw labor as a disutility, as well as his successors, such as Max Weber, who thought that labor must be induced either by way of monetary incentives or through a secularized form of spiritual sanction, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Marx could then affirm the freedom-enabling dimensions of labor or labor power, at one point referring to it as life's prime want, potentially, because he did not reduce the value of labor or work to exchange or exchange value, whose motivating structure is typically cash reward, delayed gratification, or fear of starvation and spiritual reprisal. Marx conceived of labor power instead as having intrinsic and expressive value over and above and perhaps against its extrinsic or instrumental value. Looking at the contemporary context, it is evident that the intrinsic and instrumental, as well as the expressive values associated with labor and work, are being brought into question by automation and AI. So automation here refers to a process in which certain spheres of production and service delivery are performed by machines, often in conjunction with human operation and live conflict resolution. You could think of the ATM at the bank here, or the checkout stand at the local supermarkets, right? There's still some human involvement, at least behind the scenes, if not directly in the scenes. The deployment of artificial intelligence in the labor market differs from automation, at least as I've defined it, in that it holds the promise of not only matching, but superseding and replacing the relatively scarce cognitive skills wielded by some of the world's most intelligent human beings. This phenomenon has often been characterized as the surpassing of the Polanyi paradox, or singularity in some cases. And the basic idea is that human beings, their level of intelligence can indeed be superseded by artificial intelligence, and that's bringing a lot of worries to the fore. What seems to be different this time around is the view, which has indeed been articulated most recently by Daniel Susskind, is that the specter of technological unemployment is real and palpable. For Susskind, a world without work should prompt us to take seriously the implications of technological unemployment and to contemplate a world where paid work loses the meaning, and I should add the value that has hitherto been bestowed upon it. Susskind's prognosis about technological unemployment appears to be partially borne out by recent studies, ranging in diversity from those conducted by the McKinsey Institute in 2017 to those of Frey and Osborne back in 2013. And most of them predict up to sometimes 50% of jobs being automated in the US. To be sure, that these predictive studies, and that should be the emphasis, they're predictive studies, differ in their subtle details, mostly in how they define the automation process and in the percentage of jobs that will be displaced versus replaced by technology. While nothing can be predicted with certainty, there is a growing consensus among economists that low-paying jobs will be the first on the chopping block because they're the easiest and the cheapest to automate. Here, as elsewhere, these predictive studies suggest that the most marginalized sections of the population will be the most adversely affected by automation. There's another McKinsey Institute study that's quite good on this, speaking about African Americans and how that's going to be really detrimental for the job market as far as it concerns them. So we have to keep that in mind, who will be most adversely impacted by these developments. Skeptics of the mass technologically induced unemployment thesis, such as our own Veena, who unfortunately couldn't join us, emphasize the need to distinguish conceptually between the prognosis of mass technological unemployment and underemployment, or increasing underemployment. Veena suggests that contemporary capitalism evidences the rise of precarious underemployment that is accompanied by deepening economic stagnation. I think with good reason he draws on the work of Piketty and Gordon, to make this point. While firms have been reaping profits, that hasn't ended. Deindustrialization has contributed to a decline in economic growth and a broader trajectory of economic stagnation. So we won't see the type of economic growth that we experienced in the past. In Benana's view, a decline in economic growth will mean that the total share of income going to labor will continue to atrophy and decline. While I'm sympathetic to his view, those concerned with the ethical implications of automation and the future of work must consider its implications beyond issues of inequality and distributive justice, which are indeed very important, but we must go beyond these considerations. The point I'm trying to make is a normative one, namely that work has intrinsic and expressive value beyond its extrinsic or instrumental value, and that it should be, for that reason, repoliticized and revalued in the age of automation and AI. While justified anxiety around technological unemployment has given rise to a myriad of different views, few of them, in my view, have been particularly concerned with considerations of value, which is sort of the cornerstone of this presentation and paper. At stake is the question of whether work has value for human beings beyond economic necessity and compensatory exchange. And my answer to this, unsurprisingly, is that it does. One need not be a one-sided productivist to recognize that the displacement of work can have devastating consequences for the lived experience of actual human beings. Going back to the start of the presentation, it is important to recognize that work has use value, if to use Marx's language, beyond its exchange value. Once we recognize this otherwise overlooked insight, we can take steps to revalue and repoliticize work in the future and in the present. The connection between the revaluation and repoliticization of work is closer than first meets the eye. Most proposals, and we've heard about this, for a post-work future envision an unconditional basic income. Sympathetic critics of basic income discourse, and I would situate myself in this camp because I think something like a basic income will be necessary. I have in mind here Brish and Rogers, have suggested that while the implementation of a basic income should be welcomed as a step forward, greater equality, greater inclusion, the absence of a strong social infrastructure in countries like the United States, but there are many others, including in Europe, will mean that the working and unemployed poor will remain grossly underserved by an even modest basic income in the absence of systemic transformation. And that's what I want to emphasize, the need for systemic transformation. Among the most serious shortcomings of proposals for basic income in the absence of these structural changes is a reoccurring neglect of existing political realities and constraints, as well as the perils, the more dangerous point, of succumbing to depoliticizing solutions. Beyond the generalized fear of automated unemployment, technological unemployment, market-oriented advocates routinely welcome basic income. Think of someone like Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek, precisely because it provides a basis for countering the expansion of the welfare state and curbing the power that was once wielded by trade unions through collective bargaining. Veena gives me greater hope about this. On the reverse extreme, left-wing advocates, the more radical advocates, point to an expansive basic income as the definitive way for severing the connection between work and income, between wage labor and capital, and between the productivist capitalist present and the emancipated post-work utopian future. Now, if proposals for basic income are abstracted from existing political constraints and realities, then they risk depoliticizing the future of work. The danger with depoliticization is that it transforms the debate about the future of work into a strictly technological problem, one that demands, quote unquote, a technical fix in a world with much less work, if we believe the predictive studies. The trouble is that the debate about the future of work is normatively loaded and cannot be abstracted from its political economic context. Technological possibilities have and will continue to be harnessed for different political aims. These aims are normative in character and are prescribed politically. Without disputing the state of disorganized labor today, and it may change, hopefully it will change, it is still the case that our increasingly automated present has its share of winners and losers. As soon as the future of work is cast in unambiguously political terms, we can begin to ask why the greatest share of income continues to go to capital and not to labor. Similarly, why are manufacturers of AI technology relying on a subsidized social and political infrastructure without paying the respective dues to replenishing this very political infrastructure? Sometimes they don't pay taxes at all. Relatedly, why are governments allowing public funds to be spent with the long-term goal of displacing workers and undermining effective demand if they are indeed concerned with maintaining a strong tax revenue base? To ask these questions is to repoliticize the debate around the future of work, which is otherwise left to the expertise of technologists, innovation economists, and especially futurists. Such an approach, the approach that I'm advocating, also opens the door for a broader debate about the merits of deploying AI technology in different lines of work. The question of who ought to own and control it, still very relevant in the 21st century. That is digital and intellectual property, which hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about during the discussion, and the rights and responsibilities of all those concerned. I would further argue that such a repoliticization of work must be predicated on its revaluation. Unless work is valued for the use and meaning that it continues to have for human beings, it will continue to be treated as a wretched commodity. And what do we know about commodities? They can indeed be exchanged and automated, which brings me to the rather moderate or modest proposal for reducing the length of working time. There is no good reason to think that political struggles over the reduction of working time are somehow outdated in the age of automation and AI. On the contrary, they are all the more pertinent, particularly as the cost of living continues to rise in capitalist democracies, while the total share of wealth going to labor continues to dwindle. It's interesting, Daniel Zuskin talks about how we've actually been working less hours. I think we should do more empirical work over these questions. And in any case, it'll still vary from place to place. So these are political questions, not technological ones. However, no such proposal, the proposal for reduction of working time, can be achieved without a repoliticization and reevaluation of work. The future of work is indisputably a normative and political matter. Under the present labor regime of overwork and burnout, which are all too real, the demand for reduced working hours remains a basic prerequisite for securing the freedom and dignity of workers. I mean, that's just a minimal, I think, demand at this point in time. Obviously, it would be much better for workers to have greater control and ownership of their work. The same is true for reducing mandatory retirement age for those who choose to leave the sphere of paid work. After all, the end of paid work or monetary compensated work in the form of wage labor is not the end of work as such. Indeed, a reduction in working time brings with it the possibility of diversifying the range of activities that can be performed by human beings, including often gendered and racialized forms of care work in the home, recreation, athletics, literature, engaging in the arts, education, and scientific discovery, which are not always bound by the logic of capitalist accumulation or profit making. These activities also remind us from time to time that work could be meaningful, fulfilling, and valuable beyond the present strictures of wage labor and exchange value. Thinking critically about the future of work, therefore, in this age of automation and AI, calls above all for its repoliticization and reevaluation. Thank you very much. So I guess we can proceed to the discussion. Okay, go ahead, Aleena.
I have a question for Cynthia, and it is about this kind of dichotomy between labor and leisure and livelihood and voluntarism. And I'm wondering about like all the kind of different configurations in between, and also about, you know, so platform cooperativism, and also, you know, non-platform cooperativism, and how, you know, can that inform, you know, this idea of diversity? I know that the empirical literature out there, you know, by Schultz, Schneider, and I think it's Juliet Schor, have shown that there is a lack of diversity within, you know, at least consumer cooperatives, as well as maker spaces, which also operate on cooperativist organizational structures. And it's an issue, but there are guidelines, there are policies that they are putting in place in order to mitigate the kind of homogeneity that comes through in these voluntary or in these in these kinds of organizations. So I wonder if you can speak to that, and if I can just add on a follow-up question, you know, and I know that this is not the focus of your work per se. You mentioned that at the top of your talk, but how do you see sort of, you know, do you see a new narrative for the work ethic, you know, and, you know, can you speak to that, at least in, you know, in some way, if you wish to? Thank you.
So your question about the dichotomy between work and leisure is a really good one, and your paper sort of highlights the how complicated that can be. So one thing I would throw in that you didn't mention, and I'll come back to workplace cooperativism, platform cooperativism in a moment, is the idea of compulsory service or civic work. So one of the strategies for dealing with a future of less paid work that the market generates is to return to not just public job creation, but the idea that people have an obligation to serve the society through work. It seems to me that there's lots of work to be done in our society if we could muster the social resources to pay people to deliver some of the social services and create some of the public goods. And so civic work sort of, it's not volunteer work, but it is, it's socially directed in a way that's different from most market work. And I think in some ways that's kind of the best of all worlds, although not an ultimate solution. It's a good part of the solution. Platform cooperativism and the kind of, you know, co-creating spaces that are part, I think, of the so-called sharing economy. I think there is, and I think I've tried to raise a sort of an issue about, you know, our regulatory regime defines a certain kind of relationship as significant, economically significant, to be worthy of and to be, it's justified to regulate it in the interest of diversity and non-discrimination. Largely excluded from that is the whole world of independent contracting, much of the gig economy, the way it defines itself. Platform cooperativism is on the edge. I think that employment is not the only kind of framework within which this valuable experience of working together can occur, but it is the one space that we have with some success, actually regulated the demographics of it. I think if we are expecting, if we see a relative expansion of the sphere of non-employment frames for work, we are going to have to look at expanding our regulatory framework as well, or we'll lose that advantage of having a space that we can actually, to put it bluntly, force people to work together. So I'm not sure that completely responds to your question, but that's some of what it led me to think about.
Veena, go ahead.
Hi, thank you both so much for these super interesting talks. I think this responds to both the papers, but particularly I'm interested in Cynthia's response. You know, if I were to reframe how the literature on anti-work and how you're thinking about the literature in terms of pro-work versus the anti-work literature, I might argue that that you know, from Paul Lafargue to Kathy Weeks, the anti-work theory is not about a politics of refusing work or refusing productivity or refusing creativity or you know, embracing laziness, despite Paul Lafargue's sort of very provocative title. I think it's about a refusal of sort of the ideology of work as the highest moral duty, about sort of the refusal of work as the center of social life and as the only way, you know, in the US, this is the problem, is the only way to access citizenship and rights, and most, I think most centrally, as a refusal of work as the only way, or as a refusal of the necessity of capitalist production. That, to me, is what anti-work politics is about, not necessarily not working. And so I wonder if you could, if that changes, or if that shifts, that reframing shifts sort of your relationship to that literature.
Yes, it does. And I think that, so one of the most fascinating things to me about the history of the movement for shorter hours was the strain of that movement. And this ties into a couple of things other people have said. There was one strain. Of course, there are many strains. There was, you know, we need more time for political engagement. We need more time for rest. We need health and safety is at stake with long hours. And so there were many convergent threads that went toward agitating for shorter hours up to the 8-hour compromise. But one of the strains that has gotten totally forgotten was a strain of anti-capitalism that was basically this ever shorter hours, not, you know, let's get to some, you know, happy medium of 8 hours, but as machines become ever more capable, as we can automate more and more work, as we can liberate people from the need to sell their labor to capital, we can gradually and peacefully withdraw from the worst aspects of capitalist exploitation of labor. It's a very, and the demise of that particular strain sort of after the New Deal, going into the Cold War and the rise of consumerism, it's sort of a little tragic counterpoint to a lot of other developments. But so I think that as if we revive that idea, part of the shorter hours idea is spreading work, making the benefits of work available to a wider range of people. But it also is very much about shifting the kind of center of gravity. So I feel attached, but I'm sort of trying to be critical of my own attachment to work as being the centerpiece. My work is extremely satisfying, extremely well rewarded in many ways, and I don't want to project that on the vast majority of workers for whom that is very, very far from the truth. But so I think that we should be aspiring to rebalancing lives and to finding and promoting value, stature, and mutual regard to other things that are not about paid work. I think that paid work is an important part of the balance, but I do think the idea that what you do is the overwhelmingly the first question people ask you and the way they sort of locate you in society, yeah, I think it would be good if we diversified that sense of where one's worth comes from, where your identity, where your life narrative comes from. I am temperamentally a bit of a Goldilocks, so not too hot, not too cold, right? There's like a sweet spot. And so I think that's true with work too. And I think that right now, most people have too much work. So less work, all to the good. But if we keep going the way we are, we're going to drive some people out altogether, and other people are going to be scrambling either because the rewards are so high or because the rewards are so low, scrambling to work as much as they can. That seems like very, very much worth avoiding for all sorts of reasons.
I guess I'm temperamentally a bit less of a Goldilocks to use Cynthia's approach. But I think, the challenge that Veena puts forward is a good one. We should be very careful when we valorize work, that we don't caricature proponents of post-work, to make sure we understand what they're saying. And it's true that, thinkers like Kathy Weeks, there are a number of dimensions, I think, that are worth kind of considering and taking very seriously. The undervalue of certain forms of work, right? That they're still paid really badly. And that reflects a kind of social prejudices. I mean, COVID-19 has really brought this to the fore, the frontline workers and so on. How come we don't ask, for wage increases and salary increases under normal circumstances? Why does it require a pandemic to bring this to the fore? So I think the challenge is real. We have to take these critics seriously. But then the issue I have with this particular utopian tradition is that there's this abstraction from the contemporary political constraints. And that that's what I find troubling. Not the vision of a post-capitalist conception of work or post-work, what have you. I find that this here's this universal basic income that's going to be very generous, but the question of transition, right, is left unanswered. And I'm really worried because right now people are struggling, right? People are dying, people are suffering. And we can't, Marx is, very, very opposed to detailing the blueprints for the cookshops of the future. There is something democratic and something epistemological that is relevant in this kind of wariness. But I do think that we have to repoliticize it, because the danger is the technologizing. And technologizing is always neutral, value neutral. But behind the technology, right, there are people with norms, people who try to prescribe certain views of the world. And that's, I think, what we need to be worried about. I should also say that we have a number of questions from our YouTube viewers that perhaps we could still consider in sort of 10 minutes or so. But if others have questions as well, I think Jeremias wants to jump in. Please go ahead.
Just very, very quickly, thank you both Cindy and Igor for your really interesting papers. So my baseline has for a long time been very close to Cindy's approach when it comes to UBI, which is sort of quite healthy skepticism. One thing, some colleagues here in Oxford have been doing a lot of surveys already of the population during COVID, and there seems to be a complete switch in terms of support for UBI. And actually, different labour markets are different, but what the UK government has put in place through the furlough scheme, both for the employed and the unemployed, is essentially pretty close to UBI at this point. So essentially, up to £2,500, the UK government at the moment will pay workers 80% of their usual salary. And interestingly enough, one of the conditions for the scheme is that they not work for the employer during that period. Right. And one of the things the scheme has come under sort of criticism for is the fact that maybe, there might be demand for them to work part-time or something like that. But it's explicitly a condition of the scheme not to do this. So to some extent, what we're looking at here, at least in the UK labour market, is actually a huge experiment in UBI. funded by the government. And so it'd be really interesting to see what will play out there. But one thing I think that might be really interesting for both of your papers is this explicit stipulation from the government that you mustn't work while you're on this furlough scheme.
There's another way to do this, right? And there's a very nice piece recently argued that part of the solution, the temporary solution to the pandemic, can be instead of geographic or physical separation, temporal separation. So shorten the workday, put in 2 shifts. You can spread people out by doing that. But let's think about that not as a temporary response to the pandemic, but as a better way to live, a better way to organize the future of work if indeed we are looking at a future of reduced overall demand for human labor. But the thing about the UBI, and I think I go back and forth, and I think you might have missed, Jeremias, when I talked about that great study about 8 hours a week as possibly the optimal for sort of psychosocial benefits of work. But I think that it does seem very, if you reduce hours, you have to figure out some way to replace the income that's lost. I'm not sure the answer lies in simply increasing the hourly wage to the point that you would be able to replace the lost income. And so I think that the idea of a partial universal basic income complementing a shorter workday starts to seem like, again, a kind of, best of all worlds possibility to shoot for.
Valerio, I think you were next. You wanted to jump in. Unmute yourself, please.
So, sorry. I have a question for Cindy. I agree with you that one of the very important aspects of work is the possibility of socializing with other people and having joint interests and aims. But I wonder how this will change due to the pandemic. I mean, if going to work is a risky endeavor, I may actually be not getting any benefits out of it, and we may lose out of that. And at the same time, if I don't have to go and work, if I am one of the privileged ones that can stay at home and work from home, from remote, as we all are at the moment, as speakers here, are we still doing something in that sense or not? Because I have still meetings with my PhD students regularly, but other than that, other than recording my classes, answering emails from my students, there's no face-to-face interaction anymore. And I wonder if it will change your view on this.
Can I just add very briefly, because this connects with one of the questions that our viewers have asked, namely, what, if any, are the implications of these papers that we've presented for an analysis of the impact COVID-19 has on labor policy and practices, and indeed conceptions of work? So thank you, Valerio, also for anticipating that question. So
let me just say one thing about the pandemic and automation, because I've been thinking about this too with the book manuscript that I'm writing. It seems very clear, very likely that the pandemic will accelerate automation in 2 different ways, one of which you've identified, that physical proximity starts looking like a risk. And so automation, and it's not just physical proximity among workers, of course, it's physical proximity between workers and consumers. So when I walk in, next time I walk into a store, if that ever happens again, and I confront an automated checkout, I think, so employers will find it beneficial to automate functions to reduce human contact, but people who have resisted those automated options, and which leads, of course, to companies being reluctant to automate some aspects of in-person services, that is going to break down as well, so that people's habits and what they will become familiar with and comfortable with is going to be much more friendly to automation of certain kinds of service work. But the other thing is that just as an economic matter, it seems pretty clear that automation isn't a steady process. It tends to come in waves, and it tends to actually be cyclical in some ways, so that when there's a crisis and jobs or layoffs, when firms rev back up, that's when they start thinking more seriously about whether there's a more technologically sophisticated, less labor-intensive way of doing things. And so just on the sheer economic crisis is likely to bring about an acceleration of automation. But I think that your question, Valerio, gets at a couple of other things. And so turns out a lot of people who can work at home like it. Firms have found it works in many cases better than they thought it would. And so we might see a reduction in the amount of face-to-face interaction, which I value enormously. And the problem is that, so firms don't necessarily, they don't care about generating these great societal political benefits, right? Individuals don't necessarily care. This is a collective good that is outside the calculus of either individual workers or employers. And so that's why I think that we need to be aware as a society that we could lose something even if individuals and firms are perfectly okay with a more socially isolated way of doing work. The other thing that I think firms are surely figuring out, and plays into all the things that both Valerio and Jeremias were talking about with surveillance, is working from home makes it harder for people to organize. And so I think that the decline, if what we see is a long-term decline in face-to-face interaction among workers, I think that's going to be challenging for organizers, efforts to organize workers both at the firm level, but also higher up. So I think in just about every way I can imagine, in terms of so somebody made the point that the crisis has softened, I think Jeremias said, softened resistance to UBI. Well, that could be a good thing in some ways. But in just about every other way, in terms of the impact it's likely to have on the organization of work, it makes me very anxious for some rather particular reasons about the value that I think comes from work that is not wholly captured by either individuals or by firms.
Thank you, Cynthia. Veena wanted to jump in. Please do.
Yeah, sorry, I will try not to take too much of this time, but just in conversation with Valerio, I want to point out that the sociality that emerges from work does not emerge from capitalist production. In fact, I think often sociality emerges in resistance to that kind of production. And when we think about COVID-19, what's interesting is that although we aren't, certainly many of us would prefer to have the bodies that we're interacting with around us, but that there has been sort of a commensurate shift in cognitive spaces and how people relate to each other. So, digital piecework, which I talked about, is a good example of kind of what could happen to sociality in the context of distanced work. You still see social life and social relationships emerging between and among piece workers, between and among gig workers, despite the fact that they are atomized and dispersed. You see them sharing music on Facebook pages. You see them just describing one another as co-workers, Zooming together and working, tweeting at each other. There's all kinds of different ways that people both organize and relate to one another and form community, even in this sort of technological space, while we might not imagine as ideal, is also the way many people, particularly of a particular generation, have long related to one another.
I was wondering maybe if we can take another question from our YouTube viewers, namely, how do each of us think about the role of the individual worker in this change? As work shifts, can we empower individuals to develop identities and meaning independent from work? So what do you think?
I mean, that's what collective solidarity is about, and how and sort of what an anti-work politics in particular. I think Aleena talked about this. Aleena said this so beautifully, that so much of what we're of what you might describe as a utopian vision of an anti-work future, whether it's UBI or what have you, is really about aspiring towards something, not towards capturing something through regulation in the next 5 to 10 years, but really about imagining. And I think that that kind of imagination happens through collectivities, whether it's labor unions, whether it's conferences like this, whether it's sort of conversations that happen over Facebook, whether it's sharing narratives of possibility through online spaces. But that, like, those spaces are where that pushback, I think, which is quite beautiful, really occurs.
I think I want to put in a pitch that solidarity and resistance isn't the only thing that we aspire for people to be able to do, that people's ability to live their lives and have a balanced life, something that seems to be quite missing from the people, that you're talking about, for example, having just more time that you have, that you can dispose of however you choose to do it. So I'm a little bit of a dissenter, for example. I mean, this is a related observation that the glorification of employment versus independent contracting, I think, is a little overdone. I think that if independent contracting came with a more secure social foundation, and you weren't like on your own for healthcare and benefits and all that, I think that it's a choice that more people might wish to make, in part because of greater flexibility and choice. So I think that is when people, what they're agitating for, what they need to organize for, is often a more balanced life that allows them to do other things with their time.
Others?
I would say, like echoing what Veena said, and what Cynthia mentioned, for sure, in these labor organizations, in these leisure organizations, excuse me, there is a decentering of work. So when in fact, people don't ask you, what do you do? They ask you, what other hobbies do you have? So, but here's the rub. The rub is that like historically and politically, we know that leisure it's a dialectical counterpart to capitalist societies, to employed work under capitalism. So you can't. There isn't an instance of pure leisure, because it's these two things, they are conjoined. It was created through work in many ways. I'm not talking about the sort of Platonic vision of leisure, which is an aristocratic sort of practice. I'm talking about modern leisure. So I don't know. It's sort of it's not a clear-cut identity, or it's not a clear-cut form of subjectivity or narrative, which no narratives are. So I think it's a matter of struggling through it, and it's a matter of contextualized ways of coping, and also not dismissing half measures, not dismissing kind of stopgap ways in which people are making do.
Valerio, I think you're next. Thank you.
Yeah, very briefly. So I also think that in a way, half measures could help us transition at the very least. I am not a fan of the UBI if it comes with the discourse, oh, work sucks and it's gonna suck, and therefore let's get rid of it and get UBI. I think this is actually a way of basically washing our hands and avoiding solving the problems, and people will still need to work anyhow, even if we have a full UBI. So we should not forget about it. Of course, a good system of social protection or welfare protection, and also a system of basic income can help making work better. But work is still gonna be there for some time. Now, of course, I think that we should reflect about what we consider work, and there's so much work that we do in our lives, reproductive work, care work, that is completely neglected in the policy discourse, and we should find ways to remunerate that. And a system of welfare should also take this into account. And this is something that has been missing also in stronger system of welfare in Europe as well. But at the same time, I don't subscribe with the idea that we should give up on better protecting people at work and replacing this protection with the UBI. I think this is a sort of red herring.
I guess my own view is I always feel better when I know that what I'm experiencing is also being experienced by other people. I'm not talking about suffering. I mean, in terms of organizing, right? You feel as though you're part of something bigger than your atomistic self, and that could be empowering in and of itself, whether that's online, whether that's community organizing, whether that's in the context of a protest. But we have to become aware, if we're not already, and I'm willing to grant that we are already, of our experiences, both with suffering and the gains that are made. Because collectively, if we think of it like a kind of collective struggle, and that was the point of collective bargaining, was that you could improve your individual position, right, as a consequence of bringing these struggles together. And obviously, there are going to be differences, there are going to be conflicts, but hopefully, the labor movement itself may be on the decline, but it has learned from previous forms of exclusion. And I think we have to sort of think of ourselves and our experiences not in separate islands, but in the same island, as it were, in one global world, which will have different impacts for different individuals. But I think it's sort of better to see what's going on right now is impacting everybody, and to think of our own struggles. I'm generalizing right now as being bound up with other struggles as well, because the worst thing I guess the employers can do is to divide the individual workers, to think of themselves as atoms, right? But it's when the workers come together that they can really exert collective power. That would be my view.
I face a rather difficult challenge now coming after a lot of sage statements I completely agree with in their entirety. And so I guess my conclusion would be that, again, this is about agency, whether individual or collective, right? It's about this point that automation will destroy jobs. It doesn't do that by itself. It does it because of the social, political, and economic choices we make. It comes about the fact that there's a decline in collective representation of workers and social partnership. That's not an automatic fact. That is driven by a number of political, legal, and economic choices. And so I think what might be a sort of common theme amongst these panels is that actually, whether it's UBI, whether it's some form of job guarantees, actually, these things are long-term future questions. But right now, people are working or trying to work, struggling to work, and that has to be the primary focus of policymakers. That doesn't say that people shouldn't think about UBI. That doesn't say that people shouldn't think about different models. But I strongly agree with Cindy and Valerio and others that actually people are working now, and that has to be the primary policy choice.
Do others want to jump in as well? Yeah, it's been a long but very engaging and I think a thoughtful conference. One thing I'd like to bring to the attention of our viewers and I guess also of our participants is that our individual presentations will become available as contributions to a special symposium online, Center for Ethics Journal, sometime in July. So bear with us, but we're going to make that a certainty that the work that we've presented, after we could kind of flesh it out in light of the dialogue, omnilogue that we've had, that it will indeed become available on the Center for Ethics Journal website. Are there any other final remarks at this time? Okay. Well, then let me take this opportunity to thank all of you, the presenters, for a wonderful exchange of ideas, very timely ones, particularly in the context of COVID-19. And I look forward to further discussions in written form sometime in July. And I should also add there'll be further contributions to this special symposium from other scholars who will be responding to this conference. So we're in for a treat, both politically and in a scholarly sense.
And I think thank you also from all of us to Igor, you in particular, and Marcus for organizing and bringing us together. It's been a really interesting series of suggestions. So thank you very much as well for
Thank
organizing this.
you.
Thanks very much, and keep safe and stay healthy. All the best.